Baby Birdie Hale was drowning in her own lungs, and there wasn't a thing her mother could do about it in the dark. The storm had come up fast, the way Montana storms always did. No warning, no mercy, just a wall of black sky rolling down off the mountains like the world was ending. Josie Hail stood at the kitchen basin, wringing out a wet cloth for the third time in an hour, and she heard that sound again, that wet, labored rattle coming from the back room where her 3-year-old daughter lay burning with fever. It was the sound of a child fighting to stay in this world, and Josie felt it in her chest like a wound that wouldn't close. Before we go any further into Josie Hale's story, I want to ask you something from the bottom of my heart. If you believe a child should never be thrown away, hit that subscribe button right now and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that Montana night and find out what one woman did when everything fell apart at once. The rain hit the roof in a solid sheet, so heavy it sounded like gravel being poured from a great height. The wind found every crack in the cabin walls, whistling through gaps Josie had been meaning to seal for weeks. She added it to the list in her head, the list that never got shorter. Her oldest boy, Ezra, was 15 and had the weight of a man on his shoulders without the years to back it up. He was out in the barn, checking the latches the way he did every night now, the way his father used to. Her daughter, Hattie, at 13, moved through the house like a ghost with a purpose, quiet and watchful, always measuring every word before she spent it. Clementine, at 10, hadn't spoken a single word in 7 months, not since the day her father's body was carried home on a flatbed wagon. And Sam, 6 years old and full of questions, slept curled against the wall with his boot still on his head, oblivious to the storm and the fever and the slow unraveling happening around him. Josie pressed the cool cloth to Birdie's forehead, but the child's eyes stayed closed. Her little chest rose and fell in quick, uneven shudders, each breath a battle. The doctor in town was 16 miles away, and in this weather, he might as well have been on the moon. She had nothing but cool water and prayer, and a will that had been forged by months of holding things together with bare hands. She was sitting there, willing Birdie to take a deeper breath when she heard the horse. It wasn't the sound of hooves on dry ground. She knew that sound. This was different. This was a horse in distress, the kind of high, strangled cry that an animal makes when it's past exhaustion and into something worse. It came from the direction of the front gate, close enough that Josie's head came up immediately. Then came the crash. Not thunder, something solid hitting the ground, something heavy. She was on her feet before she made the decision to stand. Ezra burst through the door with his father's old Remington rifle in his hands, his face set hard in the expression that shouldn't belong on a 15-year-old boy. He was already moving toward the door, but she caught his arm. "Stay inside," she said. He didn't lower the rifle, but he stepped back 1 pace. It was as much as she was going to get. She opened the door, and the rain came in sideways and cold, soaking her dress in seconds. She stepped onto the porch and squinted into the dark. The next flash of lightning came exactly when she needed it. A full white bloom of light across the yard. The horse was down. A big roan collapsed on its side in the mud 20 feet from the porch steps. Its sides heaved, one leg bent at a wrong angle. And behind it, tangled in the reins and dragged through the mud like a rag doll someone had thrown from a great height, was a man. He wasn't moving. She stood there for one full breath. Then she stepped off the porch into the rain. Ezra called after her, but she didn't stop. She crossed the yard, her boots sinking into the mud, and knelt beside the man. He was face down. She grabbed his shoulder and turned him. He was heavy, dense with muscle, and when she got him onto his back, she saw the blood immediately. Dark and wet, soaking through his shirt from somewhere below his left ribs. A wound that had been wrapped and then pushed too hard and torn open again. His face was weathered and dark with stubble, maybe 40 years old, maybe older. She couldn't tell. His eyes were closed. His breathing was shallow. He had the look of a man who had been running from something for a long time and had finally run past the edge of his body's willingness to cooperate. "Is he dead?" Sam's voice from the porch. He was standing there in his stocking feet, the blanket she'd put over him dragging in the wet. She told him to get inside. He asked again. She told him not to ask again. Sam disappeared. She made a decision. The same kind she'd been making for 6 months. the ones that didn't feel like decisions at all, because there was only ever one real answer. You helped. You helped because you were the kind of person who helped. She called for Ezra, and he came down into the rain with the rifle still in his hand and his mouth a straight line of disapproval. They got the man inside together, hauling him through the door and onto the floor near the stove. He was dead weight, and the rain made everything slippery, and by the time they had him down, Josie's arms were shaking. Hattie appeared from the hallway with her eyes wide and a butcher knife held flat against her thigh. Josie noticed it and said nothing. She understood. She cut the man's shirt away from the wound with kitchen shears, exposing a gash that had been roughly stitched and had come open during his ride. The edges were red and angry. Infection was starting. She pressed clean cloth against it, and the man's body reacted. A full, involuntary tightening of every muscle, a sharp intake of breath, and his eyes opened. They were gray. She noticed that first. Gray and direct, even in the state he was in, sharply alert. He looked at her face, then at the room, then back at her face. And he did it fast, the way a man looks at a space when he's checking exits. "Easy," she said. He didn't speak. His jaw was clenched against pain. She told him he'd fallen off his horse in her yard, that he had a wound that had come open, that she was going to clean it and close it as best she could. She told him to hold still. His eyes moved to Ezra standing with the rifle, then to Hattie at the stove, then to Clementine in her corner, and then stopped. He heard the sound from the back room, Bertie's wet coughing carrying through the thin wall. "That child," he said. His voice was rough, barely there. "How long has she been coughing like that?" Josie's hand stilled. She said 3 days. He tried to push himself up. She put her hand on his chest and held him down. He told her that sound was not a cold. That child was drowning inside her own lungs, and if she didn't do something in the next hour, she wouldn't see morning. The words landed in the room like stones. He said he was a surgeon. He said he could tell her exactly what to do. She looked at him, at the wound in his side, at his gray eyes, at the doorway to the back room where her daughter was losing ground. She made her decision. She told Ezra to help him up. Ezra helped him to his feet, and the man stood, gray-faced and swaying, with blood soaking through the fresh cloth at his side. He asked the child's name. Bertie, 3 years old. He moved toward the back room, slow and deliberate, one hand pressed to his side. He told her what she needed: a big pot, boiling water, a heavy blanket, and someone to hold the child. She said she would hold her. He said he knew she would. The hour that followed was the longest of her life. She sat on the floor of the back room with Bertie wrapped in the blanket tent, steam rising from the boiling pot, the heat filling the small space. Silas, he'd told her his name somewhere around the 40-minute mark. Silas Wade talked her through every minute of it. Keep the blanket tight on the sides. Don't let the steam escape. She's crying, that's good. Crying means she's breathing. Let her cry, Josie. Let her cry. She held on. Her arms ached, her eyes burned. She did not cry herself because there was no room for it, and because Silas was watching her with those gray eyes from across the room, and she would not fall apart in front of a stranger. Ezra stood in the doorway the entire time, his arms crossed, his face hard, but he didn't leave. Hattie brought fresh boiling water twice without being asked. Sam had fallen back asleep. Clementine sat in the hallway, watching everything. When Bertie's breathing finally began to ease, when the terrible wet rattle started to fade and her chest began to rise more cleanly, Josie felt it through her palms before she heard it. She pressed her hand flat against her daughter's small back and felt the difference. For one suspended moment, she could not speak at all. "There," Silas said quietly from across the room. "There she is." She got Bertie settled and turned around. Silas had gone gray around the edges. He had slid down the wall, his hand pressed hard to his side. The cloth beneath it was wet again. She told him he was bleeding. He said he was aware. She asked why he hadn't said something. He said she was busy. She crossed the room and knelt beside him. She pulled his hand away from the wound and looked at it. He let her. A man who let a woman he didn't know pull his hand away from his own body was a man who had nothing left to argue with. She worked on his wound for another hour, and he gave her instructions when she needed them. He knew what he was doing. He knew the difference between what needed immediate attention and what could wait. She followed his directions with the same calm focus she'd brought to Bertie. When it was done, she sat back on her heels. She asked where he learned all this. "Army," he said. She waited for more. There wasn't any. Not yet. She helped him to the main room and got him settled on the floor near the stove with a blanket and a pillow. She told him she would check on him before dawn. He said that wasn't necessary. She said she wasn't asking his opinion. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Pain or the beginning of a smile. She couldn't tell. She lay down on her own bed for 3 hours and did not sleep. She listened to the rain slow and stop and the night go quiet. She thought about a man who carried surgical knowledge in his hands and a wound in his side, and a name he said like it cost him something. She thought about her children and her land, and the list of things she needed to do before the week was out. Somewhere around 4 in the morning, she stopped thinking and simply lay there in the dark and breathed. Morning came hard and bright. The sky washed clean, the light almost aggressive in its cheerfulness. Silas was awake when she came out. He was sitting up against the wall, his eyes open, positioned close enough to the window to watch the yard without appearing to be watching it. She noticed the angle of his body, the way his sightline was set, and filed it away. She made coffee and handed him a cup. He held it in both hands and didn't say thank you. She found she didn't mind. Bertie woke up hungry. Sam woke up and immediately demanded to know who the man by the stove was. Silas looked at him with the expression of a man who did not have extensive experience with 6-year-olds. Sam asked about the scar on his face. Silas said a horse kicked him. Sam asked if he kicked it back. Silas blinked. No. Sam said that was probably why it kicked him again. Silas looked at him for a long moment, and something appeared in his eyes that might have been the start of a laugh, held back by years of habit. Ezra came in from morning chores and stopped when he saw Silas at the stove. His face went through 3 expressions: surprise, recalculation, and then the return of the closed, watchful look he'd worn all night. He hung his hat on the hook and poured himself coffee and stood against the far wall. The room felt smaller. The morning moved awkwardly. Silas ate what Josie put in front of him without comment. He helped himself to the basin to wash without asking. Hattie broke the quiet. She asked where he'd served. Union, 13th Infantry. He said it evenly. She asked what happened to the other years, the ones since the war. He didn't answer, but he didn't look away either. Hattie held his gaze for a moment, then went back to washing the dishes. The day passed. Silas rested because he had no choice. Josie told him flatly that if he tried to put weight on that side before she'd seen it hold through a full night, she would not be responsible for what happened. He received this instruction with the same stillness he seemed to receive most things. He sat near the stove. He watched the yard. He watched the children. He watched Clementine. Not staring, not pressing, just the occasional quiet look. The kind you give something you're trying to understand without disturbing it. Clementine noticed. She always noticed everything, but she didn't retreat to her corner when he looked. That was unusual. On the second afternoon, Sam dragged a wooden horse across the room and sat down 3 feet from Silas and began an elaborate game involving 6 different voices. Silas watched for several minutes without expression. Then he asked if the brown horse was the sheriff or the outlaw. Sam looked up with the expression of a man finding an unexpected ally. He said the horse was both, depending on who was asking. Silas said that was complicated. Sam said life was complicated and went back to his game. Josie watched this from the doorway with a dish towel in her hands. Something shifted very slightly, deep and quiet in the place where she kept things she was not yet ready to name. On the 3rd morning, Ezra rode into town for feed supplies. He came back in the early afternoon with his face set in a way Josie recognized immediately. Bad news being held very tightly under control. He unsaddled his horse, put the supplies away, and came inside. He waited until Sam was in the back room with Bertie and Hattie was hanging laundry before he spoke. He put a piece of paper on the table. It was a wanted notice. The name was right. The description was close enough. Wanted for desertion in the face of the enemy. Silas Wade, formerly captain, 13th Infantry. Reward, $500. Josie looked at the paper. She looked at her son. Ezra's voice was controlled, but just barely. "Every feed store and sheriff's office between here and Billings has one," he said. "Tom Aldrich recognized the name when I told him where I was from. He'll talk. People talk. $500 is more money than we've seen in 2 years." He paused. "Do you know what people in this county would do for $500? She said she knew. She asked where Silas was. "Out back, checking the fence line." She picked up the notice. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she walked out the back door. Silas was at the far end of the fence line. He heard her coming and turned. When he saw her face, he went very still. She held up the notice. He looked at it. He looked at her. He did not say anything. She asked if it was true. He said he disobeyed a direct order. He said the order was to move a field hospital, but there were 43 civilians sheltering in a church nearby. Women, children, 2 old men. He refused to leave. The officer who gave the order had reasons to want him removed. The desertion charge was convenient. She looked at him for a long time. She said that was a story very easy to tell and very hard to prove. She said $500 was what stood between her children and a bad winter. She wanted him to understand that. He said he understood. He said he would wait by the back fence if she wanted to send for the sheriff. He wouldn't run. She looked at him. At the wound in his side that she had cleaned with her own hands. At the fence post he'd been testing because he'd seen it was loose, and it needed doing, and he'd done it without being asked. She folded the wanted notice in half. She put it in her apron pocket. She said the corner post was rotting at the base. He'd need to pack it with wet clay before it would hold. Something moved in his eyes. Not quite surprise. Something close to it. The look of a man who has braced for one thing and been given another. He said he would see to it. She turned and walked back to the house. Inside, Ezra was still standing at the table with his arms crossed and his face hard. He looked at her empty hands. He said they needed that money. She said no, they needed this winter, and there was a difference. He said Silas could be lying. She said he could be, but she was watching and she was deciding, and that was all any of them could do. Watch and decide, and try not to be wrong about the things that matter. She turned to the stove. Outside, she heard the sound of Silas working the fence post, the dull, rhythmic labor of a man doing a small job carefully. She stood there with her hand resting on the warm side of the stove and told herself she had made a calculated decision, not an emotional one. She told herself that firmly. She wasn't entirely sure she believed it, but she stayed standing. The fire crackled. The coffee had gone bitter in the pot, and through the open door she watched him work, and she wondered what exactly she had let into her home, and what it was going to cost her. The storm had passed, but the clouds on the horizon were gathering again, darker this time, and she could feel them coming. 3 days passed in the slow, cautious rhythm of a house learning to accommodate a stranger. Silas Wade moved through the homestead like a man who had spent years learning to take up as little space as possible. He ate what was put in front of him without comment. He worked from first light until the sun went down, mending fences, splitting wood, patching gaps in the barn roof that had been leaking since before her husband died. He did not ask for payment. He did not ask for anything. And every evening, when the work was done, he sat on the porch steps with a cup of coffee and watched the horizon. And Josie watched him from the window and wondered what he was watching for. The children adjusted in their own ways. Sam attached himself to Silas like a burr, following him everywhere, narrating elaborate stories about imaginary outlaws and horses that could talk. Silas received this attention with the patient bewilderment of a man who had never been the object of a 6-year-old's devotion and had no idea what to do with it. He listened. He responded in short, practical sentences, and Sam, who had been starved for male attention since his father died, drank it in like water after a long drought. Hattie remained watchful. She asked questions. Where was Silas from? How long had he been a surgeon? Why had he come through this valley instead of any other? Silas answered what he answered and left the rest in the same careful silence, and Hattie seemed to respect that more than she would have respected a glib explanation. She stopped carrying the butcher knife when she moved through the house at night. That was something. Ezra was the hardest. He did not soften. He did not ask questions. He worked alongside Silas in the fields without speaking unless the work required it. But Josie noticed that he stopped positioning himself between Silas and the door. He stopped checking that his rifle was loaded every time Silas came inside. Small adjustments, invisible to anyone who wasn't watching for them. She was watching. Clementine remained the mystery she had been for 7 months. She did not speak to Silas. She did not speak to anyone. But she began to drift closer. She would sit in the doorway of the kitchen while Silas ate his breakfast, not looking at him, not appearing to pay attention, but there, present. Josie saw Silas notice this. He did not react. He did not try to engage her. He simply let her be there, and that, somehow, was exactly what she needed. On the 4th morning, Bertie woke up with a clear chest and a hunger that bordered on ferocious. She demanded biscuits, and demanded them loudly. And Josie stood at the stove with tears burning behind her eyes and made them. Silas came in from the barn and found Bertie sitting at the table, slapping a biscuit with both hands and babbling. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he sat down at the table across from her and said, "That's a good biscuit." Bertie offered him a piece of it, wet and mangled, and he took it and ate it without hesitation. Josie turned back to the stove so he wouldn't see her face. The morning after that, the letter came. Hattie brought it back from town, a thick envelope with the return address of a law office in Miles City. Josie opened it at the kitchen table while the children ate their breakfast. It was from Robert Annell, the lawyer Silas had written to. He had received the deed copy she'd sent. He had reviewed the pertinent language. In his professional opinion, the water access was legally inseparable from the homestead claim, and any survey claiming otherwise was, in his words, a creative fiction dressed up in official seals. He would file a preemptive response with the Territorial Land Office. He would also be available to represent her if Crane pursued litigation. His fee was enclosed. Josie read the fee. She read it twice. It was lower than she'd expected, considerably lower. She looked at Silas, who was at the sink washing the breakfast dishes, his back to her. She asked if he knew what Annell charged. He said he'd suggested a rate. He didn't turn around. She asked how he knew Annell would agree to that rate. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said he'd saved Annell's son from a gangrenous leg wound at Shiloh. The boy had been 17. He'd kept the leg. Annell had never forgotten. He turned from the sink and dried his hands, and his gray eyes met hers. Some debts, he said, don't expire. She set the letter down. Something was happening in her chest that she didn't have words for. She told him that was a good thing to have done. He said it was just what a surgeon did. She said that didn't make it any less good. He looked at her for a moment longer, then picked up the dish rag and went back to the sink. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of water and the clink of plates. Ezra came in from the barn with news that changed everything. He was holding a piece of paper, and his face was the color of the mud outside. He put the paper on the table without speaking. It was a notice of claim, filed with the Territorial Court by Virgil Crane's legal representatives. It asserted that the northeastern section of the Hail property, including the creek access, had been improperly surveyed at the time of the original homestead grant. It demanded a formal boundary review, and it requested an injunction preventing Josie from using the creek until the matter was resolved. Josie read it in silence. She felt the words land in her stomach like stones. An injunction meant she could not water her cattle. She could not irrigate the north field. She could not draw water for her house from the only reliable source on her property. The well near the house went dry in late summer. Everyone in the valley knew that. Crane knew that. She looked up from the paper. Her hands were steady, but it took effort. How long do we have? Ezra said the hearing was set for 2 weeks from today. 2 weeks. She had 2 weeks to prove that her husband's homestead deed, signed by a territorial land agent 15 years ago, was valid against a man with 3 lawyers and a pocket full of influence. She sat down. The chair creaked beneath her. The room was very still. Silas had come in from the yard. He stood in the doorway, reading the situation from her face. He asked what it said. She told him. He crossed the room and picked up the notice and read it himself, his eyes moving quickly, his jaw tightening at something on the second page. He set it down. He said, "This is a fishing expedition. They don't have a real claim. They're hoping you can't afford to fight it." She said they were right. She couldn't afford to fight it. Annelle's reduced rate was still more than she could pay without borrowing. And borrowing meant going to the bank in Miles City, which meant the bank would know her situation, which meant Crane would know her situation within the week. She looked out the window at the creek. It was running high from the storm, clear and cold and full. She could see it from here, the water she had depended on every summer since she came to this land as a bride, the water her children drank, the water that kept her garden alive when the Montana sun turned everything else to dust. She thought about what it would mean to lose it. She thought about what it would mean to fight for it. She didn't know which was harder. Silas said, "I can ride to Miles City today. I can talk to Annelle in person. He needs to see the original deed, not just the copy. And he needs to understand what Crane is doing." She looked at him. He was still recovering. His side was healing, but he tired easily, and a ride to Miles City and back was 60 miles. She said so. He said he'd managed worse. She said that wasn't an answer. He looked at her steadily. He said he was going anyway. She wanted to argue. She wanted to tell him it wasn't his fight. But the words died in her throat because they weren't true. It was his fight now. He had made it his the night he stumbled through her gate. She could pretend otherwise, but the pretending would be a lie, and she had never been good at lying, especially to herself. She took the original deed from the box under her bed and handed it to him. She watched him fold it carefully and place it inside his coat, against his chest, where it would be safe. She told him to take the bay mare because she was steadier on the trail than the roan. He nodded. She told him to be careful. He nodded again. She stood on the porch and watched him saddle the horse and swing up into the saddle with the careful economy of movement that still cost him more than he let on. He looked down at her from the saddle. His gray eyes held hers for a long moment. Then he touched the brim of his hat and turned the horse and rode out through the gate. She stood on the porch until the dust of his passage settled and the road was empty. The wind picked up. The chickens scratched in the yard. Sam came out and asked where Silas was going. She said he was going to help them. Sam said, "Like a knight?" She said, "Something like that." Sam considered this and then said knights usually had swords. She said Silas had something better. Sam asked what. She said he knew how to fix things that were broken. Sam seemed satisfied with this and went back inside. The days that followed were the longest Josie had lived through since the night her husband died. Every hour stretched. Every creak of the floorboards made her look up. Every distant sound of hooves made her heart seize. She kept the children busy, kept herself busy, but the waiting was a physical weight that settled in her chest and would not lift. She cooked, she cleaned, she mended a tear in Sam's shirt. She did not let herself think about what would happen if Silas did not come back. She did not let herself think about what it meant that she was afraid of that possibility for reasons that had nothing to do with the deed. Hattie asked her on the second evening, sitting across the table with a mending basket between them, "Mama, do you trust him?" Josie threaded a needle. She took a breath. She said, "I trust what he's done since he's been here. That's not the same as trusting him." Hattie said she knew. She said, "I think he's a good man." Josie said she thought so too. Hattie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think you're right," and she went back to her mending. On the third morning, Clementine found the bird. It had flown into the window and fallen to the ground, stunned, its wing bent at an angle that was wrong. She carried it into the house in her cupped hands, her face tight with the urgency of a child who could not use words to ask for help. She stood in the middle of the kitchen, holding the bird out, her dark eyes fixed on her mother. Josie looked at the bird. She did not know what to do with an injured bird. She was a woman who knew how to bind a wound in a man or a horse, but a bird was different, small and fragile, and the wrong touch could finish what the window had started. She was standing there trying to think when she heard Clementine's voice. It was barely a whisper, rough from disuse, the voice of someone who had forgotten how to shape sounds. "Help him." Josie went very still. She looked at her daughter. Clementine's face was pale, her lips trembling with the effort of having spoken. 7 months of silence. 7 months of watching and waiting and holding everything inside. And now, over a bird with a broken wing, she had found her voice. "Help him," Clementine said again, louder this time, and her eyes filled with tears that she did not let fall. Josie took the bird from her daughter's hands. She did not know what she was doing, but she knew what it meant to try. She found a small box and lined it with cloth. She set the bird in it, careful not to touch the wing. She told Clementine that sometimes all you could do was make a safe place and let time do the rest. Clementine nodded. She sat down beside the box. She did not speak again that day, but she had spoken. The wall had cracked. When Silas came back, it was dusk on the fourth day. Josie heard the horse before she saw it, the familiar rhythm of hooves on the track, and she was at the door before she made the decision to move. She stepped onto the porch and watched him ride through the gate. He was slumped in the saddle, and the bay mare was lathered, and he looked like a man who had pushed himself past the point of exhaustion and kept going. He swung down stiffly, favoring his side. She crossed the yard and took the reins from his hand without speaking. He looked at her. His face was gray with fatigue, but his eyes were steady. He reached into his coat and pulled out the deed, still folded, still intact. Then he pulled out a second document, thicker, official-looking, with seals and signatures. He handed it to her. He said, "Annell filed a motion for summary judgment." He argued that Crane's survey was based on an incorrect interpretation of the original territorial charter. The judge agreed. "The injunction is denied. The water rights are yours." She held the document in her hands. She looked at the seals. She looked at his face. The exhaustion was deep in his bones, and there was a shadow in his eyes that spoke of pain held back by will alone. But he was here. He had come back. She opened her mouth, but the words would not come. He said, "I told you I'd fix it." She said, "You told me you'd talk to Annell." He said, "I talked to Annell. Then I talked to the judge. Then I stood in the courtroom while Annell argued. It took 2 days." He paused. "I slept in a stable." She looked at him. The shadow in his eyes was deeper now. She saw him sway slightly and catch himself. She put her hand on his arm. She said, "Come inside." He started to say something, but she cut him off. She said, "That's not a suggestion." The corner of his mouth moved. He followed her into the house. She sat him at the table and put food in front of him and coffee in his hand, and she did not ask any of the questions that were pressing against the inside of her ribs. She let him eat. She watched his hands, strong and scarred, wrapping around the cup like it was the only steady thing in the room. When he was done, he sat back. He looked at her. He said, "There's something else." She waited. He said, "Crane was at the courthouse. He didn't speak to me, but he saw me. He knows I'm working with Annell. He knows where I'm staying." He paused. "He knows about you." She felt the weight of those words settle around her. She said she had expected that. Silas shook his head. He said, "It's not just the water claim. He had his lawyer approach me after the hearing. He made an offer. He said Crane was willing to drop the boundary dispute entirely and pay off the back taxes on the property if you would agree to sell him the northeastern section at a fair market rate. He said Crane understood that you might feel pressured and wanted to make a clean offer." She asked what Silas had told him. Silas said he told him to deliver the offer in writing, and then he walked away. He looked at her. He said, "I don't trust it. He's not the kind of man who gives up because he lost one round. This feels like he's repositioning." She nodded. She had felt it too, the quiet before the next blow. She looked at the document in her hands. The water rights were secure, for now, but she had learned a hard lesson in the past year. Nothing was ever truly secure. You held on with both hands, and you kept watching the horizon. She said she would think about the offer. Silas nodded. He did not argue. He did not push. He simply sat there, exhausted and present, and she felt something settle in her chest that she had not known was loose. Crane's written offer came 3 days later, delivered by a man in a stiff collar and polished boots who handed it over like he was passing a summons. Josie read it at the table. The terms were fair, more than fair. They were generous, generous enough to make her suspicious. She set the letter down. She said she would respond within the week. The man left. Ezra read the offer after dinner. He looked up with a furrow between his brows. He said, "This is enough to pay off the banknote and have money left over." Josie said she knew. He said, "If we sell him the northeast section, we lose the creek access." She said she knew. He said, "If we don't sell, he'll find another way." He stopped. He said, "This doesn't feel right." She looked at her son, the boy who had been forced to become a man too young, carrying burdens that should have been shared. She said she felt the same way. Ezra looked at the letter again. He said, "What do we do?" She said they would wait, they would watch, and they would trust what their instincts told them. In the back room, Clementine was sitting beside the box with the bird. The wing was still splinted with a thin strip of cloth, the bird's eyes bright and wary. Clementine had not spoken again, but she had carried the box to Silas the morning after he returned and set it in front of him without a word. He had looked at the bird, looked at her, and said, "Good job." She had sat down beside him and watched as he adjusted the splint. No words passed between them. None were needed. Josie watched through the doorway. She saw Silas's hands, gentle on the small body. She saw her daughter's face, open in a way it had not been in months. She saw the thing that was growing in the spaces between them all. A family was not something you chose. It was something that grew around you, like a tree growing around a fence post, slowly and inevitably, until you could not tell where one ended and the other began. That night, after the children were asleep, she sat on the porch with Silas. The stars were out, cold and sharp in the Montana sky. She told him about Clementine, the words she spoke. He listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "She was waiting for someone who wasn't going to try to fill the silence." She looked at him. She asked how he knew. He said it was the same thing he'd done for 20 years. You stop talking because there's no one who wants to hear what you have to say, and then you forget how. He paused. The first person who sits with you without needing you to speak, they're the one who brings you back. She said nothing. The night was cold. The stars were bright. They sat together in the quiet, and it was not a silence that needed filling. In the distance, a coyote called. The wind moved through the cottonwoods by the creek. Inside the house, 5 children slept under a roof that was still hers, and she sat beside a man who had ridden 60 miles to stand in a courtroom on her behalf, and she felt the weight of that, the slow, steady gravity of a man who did what he said he would do, who showed up, who stayed. She did not reach for him. She did not speak. But when she finally stood to go inside, she stopped at the door and looked back. He was still sitting, his eyes on the horizon, where something was moving in the dark. She followed his gaze but saw nothing. He said quietly, "There's someone out there." She went still. She asked where. He pointed, low and to the left, near the tree line. She stared into the dark. She saw nothing. He said it had been there for an hour, just watching. He said he was going to check the barn. She said she would get the rifle. He said no. He said he would handle it. The way he said it left no room for argument. She stood in the doorway and watched him cross the yard, his form disappearing into the darkness. She did not go inside. She stood on the porch with her arms wrapped around herself, listening to the night, waiting for a sound that would tell her everything was all right. The silence stretched. The wind picked up. A horse stamped in the barn. Then she heard boots on the hard ground returning. His shape emerged from the dark, solid and unhurried. He reached the porch and stopped. He said it was gone, whoever it was. He didn't think they'd be back tonight. She asked if he was sure. He said he wasn't sure of anything. But he had a feeling that whatever Crane was planning, it wasn't going to come through the dark with a spyglass. It was going to come through the courts, through the mail, through the slow grind of money and influence that had crushed people like her before. He said, "We need to be ready for that." She looked at him, standing in the porch light, exhausted and unshaven, his hand pressed absently to his side where the wound had been. She thought about how many times in the past weeks she had said, We need to be ready. We have to decide. We will get through this." She had not noticed when she started including him in that word. She noticed now. She said, "You could leave. You know that." He met her eyes. He said, "I know." She said, "You've done enough. More than enough. The warrant is cleared. The water rights are secure. You don't owe us anything else." He looked at her for a long moment. The wind moved between them, carrying the smell of dry grass and the distant scent of rain. He said, "That's true. I don't owe you anything." He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. She understood. He was not staying because he owed her. He was staying because he wanted to, And that was a different thing entirely, more fragile and more precious and far more terrifying. She did not know what to do with it. So she did what she always did when the world asked more of her than she had to give. She stood her ground. She held his gaze, and she said, "Good night, Silas." He touched the brim of his hat. "Good night, Josie." She went inside and closed the door. She barred it, not because she thought he would come through it, but because she needed the action, the ritual of securing her home. She stood in the dark kitchen, listening to the house settle around her. The children breathed in their sleep, the fire crackled down to embers, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the window, a shadow moved and then was gone, and she was left with the weight of a choice she had not fully made, and the certainty that the ground beneath her was shifting, and she could not see what came next. The morning came cold and gray. The sky pressed low over the Montana Valley like a lid on a pot. Josie woke before dawn, as she always did, and lay still for a moment listening to the quiet. Bertie's breathing was steady and clear from the back room. Sam was murmuring in his sleep about something that involved horses and a very large biscuit. Somewhere in the house a floorboard creaked, and she knew it was Silas, already up, already moving. That man never seemed to sleep more than 3 hours at a stretch. She had noticed that about him in the weeks since he had come. He slept like a man who had learned that sleep was a vulnerability, and she wondered what had taught him that lesson. She got up and dressed, and found him on the porch, standing with his back to the door, looking out at the yard. The coffee was already made. He had left a cup on the railing for her, steam rising in the cold air. She picked it up and stood beside him without speaking. The sun was just beginning to lighten the eastern sky, a pale band of yellow through the clouds. The grass was wet with dew, and the air smelled of earth and the coming rain. She asked if he had seen anything else last night. He said no, but he had found tracks near the tree line. Boot prints, not horse. Someone had been standing there for a while. He had followed them to the road, where they met the tracks of a horse. The watcher had ridden away, not walked. He said it was a professional job. Someone who knew how to move without being seen and how to leave without leaving much behind. She asked if he thought it was Crane's man. He said he didn't know who else it would be. The water claim was settled, but that didn't mean Crane was done. A man like that didn't stop because he lost one battle. He changed tactics. She asked what he thought the next tactic would be. He looked at the horizon. He said, "Something that can't be stopped in a courtroom." The words hung in the air between them. She drank her coffee. It was bitter, the way she liked it. She said they would be ready. He said he hoped so. It was not a comforting answer, but it was an honest one, and she had learned to value honesty over comfort. The day began the way all days began on the homestead. Hattie came out to help with breakfast, her braids still half undone, her eyes heavy but focused. She asked Silas about the tracks. He told her what he had told Josie. She nodded and did not ask further questions. That was Hattie's way. She gathered information and filed it away and waited to see what it would be needed for. Sam came tumbling out of the back room, demanding to know if they were going to catch the spy. Silas looked at him. He said, "Spy?" Sam said, "The bad man watching us last night. Mama said someone was out there." Silas glanced at Josie. She had not told Sam about the watcher. Sam had apparently heard it from somewhere, the way children always heard things they were not supposed to hear. Silas said, "We don't know if he was bad, he was just watching." Sam said, "Spies are always bad. That's what spies are for." Silas considered this. He said, "That's a fair point." Sam nodded, satisfied, and went to find his boots. Clementine came into the kitchen carrying the bird box. She set it on the table and opened the lid. The bird was sitting up, its wing held tight against its body, but its eyes were bright, and it turned its head to look at her. Clementine looked at Silas. She said, "It's better." 2 words. Her voice was still rough, still uncertain, but stronger than the day before. Silas looked at the bird. He said, "It is." He looked at Clementine. He said, "You did that." She looked down at the bird. She did not smile, but something passed across her face that was close to it. She closed the lid and carried the box back to her corner. Ezra came in from the barn with mud on his boots and a look on his face that Josie recognized. Something was wrong. He did not speak until he had washed his hands and poured himself coffee and sat down at the table. Then he said, "The fence along the north pasture was cut, 3 posts pulled out, wire snapped." He had found it when he went to check on the cattle. He said, "The herd is still in the south field, so nothing got out. But someone went through the trouble of cutting that fence." Silas set down his coffee. He asked if Ezra had seen anything else. Ezra said he had found boot prints. He said they matched the ones Silas had found near the tree line. The same man had been on their property in the night. Josie asked if they were sure. Ezra said he was sure. He had compared them himself. The kitchen was very still. The fire popped in the stove. Bertie babbled something from the back room. Josie looked at the faces around her table. Her children. The man who had come in the storm. She said, "He's testing us, seeing how we respond, seeing how fast we can fix things." Silas nodded. He said, "He's also telling us that he can get onto our land whenever he wants." She felt the weight of that settle around her shoulders. She said, "Then we make it harder for him. We set a watch." Ezra looked up. He said, "I can take the first shift." Silas said he would take the late shift. Hattie said she could take the middle watch. Josie said no. Hattie started to argue. Josie cut her off. She said, "You watch inside. You keep the little ones safe. That's your job." Hattie's jaw tightened, but she nodded. The day passed with the tension of a pulled wire. Silas and Ezra repaired the fence, working in silence, moving with the efficiency of men who had learned to handle problems without discussion. Josie worked in the garden, pulling weeds, trying to think. The sky stayed gray, and the wind carried the promise of more rain. She could feel the season turning, the long Montana summer giving way to the hard months ahead, and she felt the pressure of time like a hand on her back. In the afternoon, a rider appeared on the road. Josie saw him from the garden and straightened. He was coming from the direction of town, moving at a steady trot, not hurried, not casual. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the yard. Silas came up from the fence line, Ezra beside him. They stood together and watched the rider approach. He was a man she did not recognize, mid-40s, with a weathered face and eyes that took in everything without appearing to look. He wore a suit coat that had seen better days and a hat that sat squarely on his head. He reined in at the gate and looked at the 3 of them standing in the yard. He tipped his hat. "Mrs. Hail." He said his name was Phelps. He worked for Mr. Crane. Josie did not invite him in. She stood where she was and waited. Phelps seemed to understand that he would not be offered hospitality. He reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope. He said, "Mr. Crane asked me to deliver this personally. He said he wanted to make sure you received it before the end of the week." He held it out. Josie took it. She did not open it. She said, "Is there a response expected?" Phelps said, "Mr. Crane hoped to hear from her within a few days. He said the offer was generous and time-sensitive." He tipped his hat again and turned his horse and rode back the way he had come. Josie stood in the yard holding the envelope. It was heavier than the last one, thicker. She felt the weight of it, the weight of what it probably contained. She opened it there, in the yard, with the wind pulling at the paper. It was a purchase offer, for the entire property. All 320 acres, the house, the barn, the creek access, everything. The price was enough to buy a house in town, enough to start over somewhere else, enough to give her children a life that did not involve the constant grind of survival. She read it twice. She folded it and put it in her apron pocket. Ezra asked what it was. She told him. He was quiet. Silas was quiet. The wind moved across the yard, rustling the dry grass. Ezra said, "That's a lot of money." She said it was. He said, "It would mean leaving." She said it would. He said, "Do you want to leave?" She looked at the house, the barn, the creek, the land that had been her husband's dream and her burden. She said, "I don't know." Ezra looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back to the fence line. Silas did not move. He stood beside her, present and silent, and she felt the steadiness of him like a hand at her back. She said, "You think I should refuse?" He said, "I think you should decide based on what you want, not what you're afraid of." She looked at him. She said, "What if I don't know what I want?" He met her eyes. He said, Then you take the time to find out. There's no hurry." She laughed, a short, surprised laugh. She said, "There's always a hurry. The crops don't wait. The cattle don't wait. The seasons don't wait." He said, "I know, but this decision, it's not about the season. It's about the rest of your life. That can wait a few days." She looked at him, the gray eyes steady, the face that had learned to hold everything inside. She said, "When did you get so wise?" He said, "I've been sitting on a lot of porches watching a lot of horizons. You pick things up." She almost smiled. She did not, but she almost did. That night, after dinner, she sat at the table with the envelope in front of her. She had not opened it again. She did not need to. She knew the numbers. She knew what they meant. She looked at the walls of her kitchen, the worn floorboards, the stove that had seen better days, the roof that needed patching in 3 places. She looked at the door to the back room where Bertie slept. She looked at the empty chair across from her where Silas had sat that morning. She thought about what it would mean to leave this place, the place where she had buried her husband, the place where she had brought her children home from the hospital, the place where she had learned to be alone. She thought about what it would mean to stay, the constant struggle, the threat that hung over them like a cloud. She heard footsteps on the porch. The door opened. Silas came in and stopped when he saw her at the table. He asked if she was all right. She said she was thinking. He sat down across from her. He did not look at the envelope. He waited. She said, "When Thomas was alive, we used to talk about the future. We had plans. Expand the herd, build a bigger barn, send Ezra to school in the East." She paused. "After he died, I stopped making plans. It felt like the universe was telling me that planning was a waste of time." She looked at him. "I don't know how to start planning again." He said, "You don't have to plan the whole future, just the next step." She asked what the next step was. He said, "Deciding whether you want to stay." She said she did want to stay. The words came out before she knew she was going to say them. She said, "This land is hard, but it's mine. It's my children's. I don't want to give it up." He said, "Then don't." She said, "It's not that simple." He said, "It is that simple. The complicated part is figuring out how to make it work. But the decision itself is simple. You know what you want." She looked at him. The lamp cast shadows across his face. She said, "You sound very sure." He said, "I'm not sure about much, but I'm sure about that." She folded the envelope and put it back in her apron pocket. She said, "I'll write to Crane tomorrow. I'll refuse the offer." He nodded. He stood. He said, "I'll check the fence line before bed." He paused at the door. He said, "Josie." She looked up. He said, "You're not doing this alone." Then he went out into the night. She sat at the table for a long time. The fire crackled. The wind pressed against the windows. She put her hand over the envelope in her pocket and felt the shape of it, the weight of the choice she had made. She did not know if it was the right choice, but it was hers, and she had made it. And that was enough for tonight. The next morning, she wrote the letter. She wrote it in her careful hand, the hand she had learned from her mother, who had learned from her mother before her. She wrote that she appreciated Mr. Crane's interest, but that the Hail property was not for sale. She wrote that she intended to continue working the land as her husband had intended. She sealed it and gave it to Hattie to post. Hattie took it without a word and rode into town. The morning passed. The work went on. Silas repaired a section of the barn roof that had been leaking since spring. Ezra worked the north field. Josie hung laundry and watched the road. She did not know what she expected. A response, a threat, something. The road stayed empty. In the afternoon, Clementine came out of the house carrying the bird box. She walked to where Silas was working on the roof and held the box up. He climbed down and took the box from her and opened it. The bird was standing on both feet. Its wing was still held close, but it was stronger. It hopped to the edge of the box and looked at the sky. Silas said, "I think he's ready." Clementine said, "He might fly." Silas said, "He might." He lifted the box and tilted it gently. The bird hesitated. It looked at the sky. Then it spread its wings, one stronger than the other, and launched itself into the air. It flew low, wobbling, and landed in the cottonwood tree by the creek. It sat there, catching its breath. Clementine watched it. Her face was still, but her eyes were bright. She said, "He made it." Silas said, "He did." She looked at him. She said, "Thank you." He said, "You did the work." She shook her head. She said, "You showed me how." Josie watched from the porch. She felt something move in her chest, something that had been locked for a long time. She watched her daughter turn and walk back to the house. She watched Silas put the box down and pick up his hammer and climb back onto the roof. She watched the bird in the cottonwood preen its feathers, and she thought about the word that had settled in her chest the night before. Stay. She was going to stay. And she was going to fight for this place, and for these people, and for the strange man who had fallen into her yard and become part of something she had not known was missing. The sun was beginning to sink when Ezra came running from the barn. He was not a boy who ran. He had not run since his father died. He came at a full sprint, his face white, his breath coming in gasps. "Mama." He stopped in front of her, bent over, hands on his knees. "Mama, the cattle," he said. "They're gone." Josie felt the words land like a blow. "Gone? What do you mean, gone?" Ezra straightened. He said, "The gate to the south pasture is open. The herd is not in the field. I tracked them for half a mile. They were driven out. Not spooked, driven. Someone opened the gate and pushed them through." He paused. He said, "They're heading toward Crane's land." The world narrowed. Josie stood in the yard with the sun going down and the cold wind rising, and the knowledge that Crane had made his next move. Not through the courts, not through letters. Through the one thing she could not protect against in the dark. Her cattle, her livelihood. The herd that was supposed to see them through the winter. Silas was already moving. He grabbed his coat from the porch. He said, "I'll find them." Ezra said, "I'm coming." Silas said, "No, you stay here. Keep the house secure. This might be a distraction." He looked at Josie. His gray eyes were hard. He said, "I'll bring them back." She said, "Silas." He stopped. She said, "Be careful." He nodded, and then he was gone, swinging up onto the bay mare and riding out through the gate into the fading light. Josie stood in the yard. The chickens scratched in the dirt. The wind blew. She watched until she could not see him anymore. Then she turned and went inside. Hattie was standing in the kitchen with a rifle in her hands. She had Clementine and Sam in the back room with Bertie. She said, "The door is barred." Josie said, "Good." Hattie said, "What do we do?" Josie said, "We wait." She looked at her daughter. She said, "And we trust him." The hours passed. The sun went down. The dark came cold and complete. Josie sat at the table with the lamp burning low. She did not light another. She wanted to see the dark outside the window. She wanted to know if anyone was out there. Hattie sat in the corner with the rifle across her knees. The little ones were asleep. The house was quiet. Josie thought about Silas riding out alone into the night. She thought about the cattle, the work of years, the herd Thomas had built from a handful of calves. She thought about Crane, sitting in his house somewhere, giving orders, moving pieces on a board. She thought about the letter she had sent that morning, refusing his offer. She thought about what it meant that the cattle had been driven out the same day. She was still thinking when she heard the sound. Hooves, slow, tired, coming up the track. She was at the door before she made the decision to stand. She opened it and stepped onto the porch. The moon was behind clouds. She could not see, but she heard his voice. "Josie." It was Silas. She said, "Are you all right?" He said, "I'm fine." He dismounted. She saw him in the faint light leading the bay mare. Behind him, a shadow of movement, the shape of cattle lowing softly. He said, "I found them. They were on Crane's land, a mile past the boundary." He said he had pushed them back through the gate and fixed the latch. He said he had seen a man watching from the ridge, a man who did not approach. She said, "You did it." He said, "We got lucky." He did not sound lucky. He sounded like a man who knew that luck ran out. He tied the horse and came up onto the porch. He stopped close to her. He said, "He knows he can reach us. He knows he can reach the things we depend on, and there's not much we can do to stop him." She looked at him. His face was drawn, tired, shadowed. She said, "We can fight." He said, We can. But we need to be smart about it. We need to think ahead. She said, I know. She felt the weight of the night pressing down on her, the exhaustion, the fear, the hope that she did not dare to name. She said, thank you for bringing them back. He said, I told you I wasn't leaving. They stood together on the porch. The cattle milled in the yard, settling, safe. The wind moved through the cottonwoods. Somewhere in the distance a coyote called. And in the dark beyond the ridge a man was watching, and they both knew this was not over. It was only the beginning of a war that would not be fought in courtrooms, but in the fields and the fences, and the long nights of the Montana winter that was coming like a blade, silent and patient and sharp. The morning after the cattle came home, Josie woke before dawn with a weight in her chest that had nothing to do with the work ahead. She lay still in the dark, listening to the house breathe around her. Bertie was quiet. Sam was murmuring in his sleep. Somewhere in the main room she heard the soft creak of a floorboard and knew Silas was already up, already moving. That man never rested. He had ridden half the night to bring back the herd, and he was still awake before she was. She wondered what drove him, what kept him from sleeping the way normal people slept. She did not have an answer, but she had a feeling it was the same thing that had driven him through 20 years of running. She dressed in the dark and went out to the kitchen. Silas was at the stove, pouring coffee into 2 cups. He handed her one without a word. She took it and wrapped her hands around the warmth. The lamplight caught the lines in his face, the gray at his temples, the set of his jaw. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had not yet found a place to set it down. She asked if he had slept. He said a few hours. She said that was not enough. He said it was enough. She let it go. She had learned that arguing with him about rest was like arguing with the weather. He would do what he would do. They sat at the table. The fire crackled. The coffee was strong and bitter. She asked what they were going to do about Crane. He said they needed to make it harder for him to reach them. They needed to set watches, secure the perimeter, keep the stock closer to the house. They needed to make themselves a target that was not worth the trouble. She said, that's not an answer. He said, it's the only answer I have right now. She looked at him. She said, how long do you think this will go on? He considered the question. He said, until he finds something else to want, or until someone stops him. She said, no one's going to stop him. The law is slow, and he has a lot of money. He said, I know. The quiet settled around them. Outside, the first birds were beginning to call. The sky was lightening, pale gray through the window. She said, I'm not going to let him take this place. He looked at her. He said, I know that too. Ezra came in before the sun was fully up. He looked at the two of them sitting at the table, and something passed across his face that was not quite approval, not quite resignation. He poured himself coffee and sat down. He said, I've been thinking. The fence along the north pasture needs to be reinforced. If we post it with thicker wire and set it deeper, it'll be harder to cut. He looked at Silas. If you're willing to help, we could have it done in 2 days. Silas said he was willing. Ezra nodded. It was a small thing, that exchange, but Josie felt it like a stone settling into place. Ezra had asked for help, not from his mother, not from a hired hand, but from Silas. It was the first time he had done that. She looked at her son. He did not look back. He was staring at his coffee, his jaw set, as if he was not entirely sure what he had just done, and was waiting to see if it would hold. The morning passed in hard work. Silas and Ezra worked the fence line together, moving in a rhythm that grew smoother as the hours went on. They did not talk much, but they did not need to. They handed tools without being asked. They stepped around each other's movements with the ease of men who were learning to trust each other's competence. Josie watched from the garden and felt something in her chest loosen just slightly. In the afternoon, Hattie came to find her. She said, Mama, there's a wagon coming. Josie straightened and wiped the dirt from her hands. She walked to the front of the house and saw it. A wagon, old and battered, drawn by a mule that looked like it had seen better days. The driver was a woman, broad-shouldered and gray-haired, with a face like cracked leather and eyes that missed nothing. She pulled up in the yard and looked around with the slow, deliberate assessment of someone who was used to judging a situation before she committed to it. She said, "You Josie Hail?" Josie said she was. The woman said, "I'm Martha Pendleton. I own the general store in town. I heard you had some trouble with your cattle." Josie said she did. Martha said, "I heard you got them back." She looked at the house, the barn, the clothesline with the laundry flapping in the wind. She said, "I also heard Virgil Crane is trying to run you off." Josie said nothing. Martha nodded, as if Josie's silence was answer enough. She reached into the wagon and pulled out a crate. She said, "This is for you. Some supplies. Canned goods, flour, salt, a few things I thought you might need." Josie looked at the crate. She said, "I didn't order anything." Martha said, "I know. It's a gift." Josie said, "I can't accept that." Martha said, "You can and you will. I've been in this valley 30 years. I watched Crane run off 3 families before you. I watched him take their water, their land, their dreams. I watched them leave with nothing." She set the crate down on the ground. She said, "You're the first person in 10 years who's fought him in court and won. That's worth a crate of flour." Josie looked at the woman. She felt the weight of the offer, the generosity of a stranger who had decided to stand with her. She said, "Thank you." Martha said, "Don't thank me yet. Crane has a long memory. He'll make you pay for that court victory one way or another. But when he does, you remember that there are people in this valley who want you to stay." She climbed back onto the wagon. She said, "You need anything else? You send word." Then she clucked to the mule and drove away. Josie stood in the yard looking at the crate. She felt something shift inside her, a small warmth in the cold place where she had been holding everything alone. She carried the crate inside. Hattie helped her unpack it. Flour, sugar, coffee, a slab of salt pork, a bag of dried beans, and at the bottom, a small tin of peppermints. Sam found those and immediately demanded one. Hattie gave him one and took one herself. She looked at Josie. She said, "Maybe we're not as alone as we thought." Josie said, "Maybe we're not." That evening, after dinner, Silas found her on the porch. He sat down beside her without asking. They watched the sun go down, the sky turning orange and then purple, and then a deep, bruised blue. The air was cool, carrying the smell of dry grass and wood smoke. She told him about Martha Pendleton. He listened. He said, "That's good." She said, "It feels like something is changing." He said, "It feels like people are starting to choose sides." She looked at him. She said, "Which side are you on?" He met her eyes. He said, "I thought that was obvious." She said, "Nothing about you is obvious." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm on your side. I have been since the night I fell off my horse in your yard." She held his gaze. She said, "Why?" He said, "Because you didn't let me die in the mud. Because you believed me when I told you I was a surgeon. Because you fed me and you let me stay, and you made me feel like I was not a ghost." He paused. "Because you have 5 children who look at me like I might be worth something." She did not know what to say. The words sat between them, heavy and real and terrifying. She said, "I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to fight a man like Crane. I don't know how to keep my children safe. I don't know how to trust that this is going to work." He said, "Neither do I, but we figure it out as we go." She laughed, a short, surprised sound. She said, "That's the most reassuring thing you've said all week." He said, "I'm not good at reassurance." She said, "I noticed." She looked at him. The lamplight from the window fell across his face. She said, "I'm glad you're here." He said, "I'm glad I'm here too." They sat in the quiet. The stars came out, one by one, cold and sharp in the Montana sky. The wind picked up and she shivered. He took off his coat and put it around her shoulders. It was warm from his body and smelled of leather and horses, and something else, something that was just him. She pulled it tighter. She did not say thank you. She did not need to. The next morning the well went dry. Josie knew something was wrong when she went to draw water for breakfast, and the bucket came up with only a few inches of muddy silt at the bottom. She tried again. Same result. She stood at the well, looking down into the darkness, and felt the ground shift beneath her feet. The well had never gone dry in August. Never. Not in the driest summers. Not in the years of drought. She knew what this meant. She knew who had done it. She found Ezra in the barn. She told him. His face went white. He said, "He poisoned the well." She said, "I don't know if it's poisoned, but it's dry." He said, "This is how he gets us. Without the well, we have to use the creek, and the creek is on the section he claims he owns." He paused. He said, "If we use it, he can take us to court for trespassing." She said, "We have the court ruling." He said, "We have a preliminary ruling. It's not final. If he can prove we're using the water without a clear legal right, he can get an injunction while the appeal is pending. And by the time the appeal is decided, it'll be winter, and we'll have no water." She looked at her son, 15 years old and thinking like a lawyer. She said, "When did you get so smart?" He said, "I had a good teacher." He looked at her. He said, "What do we do?" She said, "We use the creek, and we dare him to stop us." She walked to the creek with a bucket. She knelt and filled it with the clear, cold water. She stood and carried it back to the house. She did not look over her shoulder. She did not hurry. She moved with the deliberate steadiness of a woman who had made her choice and was not going to be hurried by fear. The water in the creek was good. She used it to make coffee, to wash the breakfast dishes, to start the laundry. She did not think about what Crane would do. She thought about what she would do when he came. He came 3 days later. Not Crane himself, but his lawyer, the same man who had delivered the purchase offer. He arrived on a fine horse, wearing a suit that cost more than Josie's entire wardrobe. He dismounted in the yard and removed his hat, and smiled a smile that did not reach his eyes. He said, "Mrs. Hale, I'm here on behalf of Mr. Crane. He said he had reason to believe you were using the creek for domestic purposes. He said that in light of the pending appeal, Mr. Crane requests that you refrain from using the water until the legal question is resolved." Josie looked at him. She said, "The court ruled in my favor." The lawyer said, "The court issued a preliminary ruling. Mr. Crane has filed an appeal. Until the appeal is decided, the legal status of the water rights is in question." He smiled again. He said, "Mr. Crane would prefer to settle this without further legal action, but if you continue to use the water, he will have no choice but to seek an injunction." She said, "Seek it." The lawyer's smile flickered. He said, "Mrs. Hale, I don't think you understand the seriousness of the situation." She said, "I understand it perfectly. I have 5 children and a homestead that depends on that water. I have a court ruling that says the water is mine, and I have a man named Virgil Crane who thinks he can starve me out." She stepped closer. She said, "You tell Mr. Crane that I will use the water from my creek until a judge tells me I cannot, and when that judge tells me I cannot, I will appeal. And I will keep appealing until I run out of money, or he runs out of patience. And I don't run out of patience." The lawyer looked at her for a long moment. Then he put his hat back on. He said, "I'll deliver your message." He mounted his horse and rode out. Josie stood in the yard until he was gone. Then she walked to the creek and filled another bucket. She carried it back to the house. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady when she called to Hattie to start the laundry. That night, Silas said they needed to talk about what happened if Crane got the injunction. She said she didn't want to talk about it. He said, "We have to. If he cuts off the water, you'll have to haul it from the river. That's 8 miles each way. With 1 wagon and 2 horses, you can make 2 trips a day. That might be enough for drinking and cooking, but not for the cattle." She said, "I know." He said, "You'd have to sell the cattle." She said, "I know." The word hung in the air. The cattle were their future. The calves born this spring would have been sold next year to pay off the banknote. Without them, they would lose the land. It was that simple. She said, "I know what I'm doing." He said, "I know you do." He did not argue. He did not offer advice. He simply sat with her in the weight of what was coming. And that, more than anything, made her feel like she might be able to bear it. The next morning, a rider came from town. It was not Martha Pendleton. It was a boy, maybe 14, on a tired pony. He handed Josie a folded piece of paper and said, "Mrs. Pendleton said to give you this." She opened it. The note was brief, written in a firm, no-nonsense hand. "Josie, I heard about the well. There's a man in town named of Hammond. He's a well digger and he's good. He owes me a favor. He'll be out tomorrow to look at your well. Don't argue. M. Pendleton." Josie read it twice. She folded it and put it in her apron pocket. She looked at the boy. She said, "Tell Mrs. Pendleton thank you." The boy nodded and rode off. The well digger came the next day, as promised. He was a small man, with large hands and a quiet manner. He lowered a weight into the well and then pulled it back up. He looked at the debris that clung to the rope. He said, "Someone dropped a rock down there, big one, blocked the flow." He said it would take a day to clear it. He said it would cost $20. Josie said she did not have $20. He said, "Mrs. Pendleton said to put it on her account." Josie stood in the yard and watched the man work. He worked steadily, methodically, with the patience of someone who had done this many times. By evening, he had cleared the blockage and the water was rising again. He said, "It'll be muddy for a day or two, but it'll clear." He packed his tools and left. Josie stood at the well. She lowered the bucket and brought it up full of clear, cold water. She held it in both hands and felt the weight of it, the gift of it. She thought about Martha Pendleton, a woman she barely knew, who had decided to stand with her. She thought about the valley and the people in it. She thought about the long winter ahead and the war that was not over. She carried the water inside. She made coffee. She sat at the table with Silas and Ezra and Hattie and poured the thick, dark coffee into their cups. The night was quiet. The lamp burned low. They sat together in the circle of light, and for a moment the weight lifted. It was small, that moment. It would not last. But it was real. And in the dark outside, someone was watching. She could feel it. The same presence from the tree line, the same patient, waiting eyes. She did not go to the door. She did not check the latch. She sat where she was, in the light, with her people around her. She refused to give the darkness the satisfaction of her fear. The next morning, the barn was on fire. The smoke hit Josie before the cry did. She was standing at the kitchen basin, washing the breakfast dishes, when the smell curled through the crack beneath the back door, sharp and acrid and wrong. She dropped the cup she was holding. It hit the floor and shattered, but she did not stop to pick it up. She was already moving, already running, her boots pounding across the floorboards, her hand reaching for the door. She threw it open, and the heat hit her like a wall. The barn was burning. The whole west wall was engulfed, flames climbing the dry wood, reaching for the roof with greedy fingers. The fire had already found the hayloft. She could hear the horses inside, screaming, not the sound of distress, but the sound of terror, the high, wild cry of animals who knew they were trapped. The sound cut through her chest like a blade. She did not stop to think. She was already running. Ezra was coming from the well, a bucket in each hand, his face white against the orange glow. Hattie was behind him, her braids flying, her mouth open but no sound coming out. Silas came from the fence line, moving faster than she had ever seen him move, his coat already off, his arms already reaching for the bucket Ezra was carrying. Josie grabbed the second bucket and ran to the well. The water was still clear, still rising, and she hauled it up with shaking arms and threw it against the barn wall. It made no difference. The flames barely wavered. She ran back for more. The world narrowed to the rhythm. Well, bucket, throw. Well, bucket, throw. Her arms burned. Her eyes stung from the smoke. She could hear Sam screaming somewhere behind her, and she heard Bertie crying. And she heard Clementine's voice, high and clear, calling her name, and she could not stop. She could not stop. The horses were still screaming. Silas passed her, running toward the barn door. She screamed at him to stop. He did not stop. He threw open the door, and the flames inside were already climbing the walls. The heat so intense it made the air shimmer. She saw him disappear into the smoke, and she felt her heart stop. Ezra was at her side. He said, "Mama, the roof is going." She looked up. The flames had found the ridge beam, and the whole structure was groaning, shifting, the weight of the roof beginning to sag. She said, "Silas is in there." Ezra grabbed her arm. He said, "I know." He was looking at the barn, his face a mask of desperation and fear. She pulled away from him. She ran toward the door. The heat stopped her 3 feet from the entrance. It was like walking into an oven, the air itself on fire. She could not see. She could not breathe. She screamed his name. The horses screamed. The roof groaned. And then he was there, emerging from the smoke, leading the bay mare by the halter. The horse was wild-eyed, its coat singed, but alive. Behind him he had the roan by a rope. He was coughing, his face black with soot, his eyes streaming. He pushed the horses toward her and turned back. She said, "No," he said, "there's one more." He went back in. She stood in the yard, holding the bay mare, watching the barn burn, and she felt something crack open inside her. The heat was unbearable, the smoke was thick enough to choke on, and he had gone back in. For a horse. The seconds stretched. The roof groaned again, and a section of it collapsed, sending a shower of sparks into the sky. The horses were trying to pull away from her, but she held on. She held on because if she let go, she would fall apart. And then he came out again. The third horse, the old gelding, stumbling behind him, its mane smoking, its eyes white with terror. Silas was leaning on the horse, barely standing. He was coughing so hard he could not speak. He made it 10 feet from the barn when the roof came down. The sound was like thunder, like the end of something. The flames surged upward, triumphant, and the barn became a pyre. Josie stood in the yard with the horses, with her children, with the man who had walked into fire and come back out, and she could not speak. The fire burned for another hour. There was nothing to do but watch. They formed a bucket line to keep it from spreading to the house, to the fence line, to the dry grass of the pasture. The neighbors must have seen the smoke. By the time the fire had burned down to embers, 3 wagons had arrived from the valley. Martha Pendleton was among them. She climbed down and looked at the smoking ruin of the barn and said, "Well, that's a message if I ever saw one." Josie could not answer. She was standing in the yard, covered in soot and ash, her hands blistered from the buckets, her throat raw from the smoke. Silas was sitting on the porch steps, his head in his hands, his breath still ragged. Ezra was leading the horses to the creek. Hattie had taken the children inside. The neighbors stood in a loose circle, uncertain, waiting to see what she would do. She did not know what to do. She looked at the barn, the charred remains of the hay and the tack, and the tools that had been stored there. She thought about the harness that had belonged to Thomas, the one she had been meaning to repair. She thought about the saddle that had been her wedding present. She thought about the feed that would have gotten them through the winter. She thought about the man who had set the fire, the man she knew had been sent by Crane, and she felt something rise in her chest that was not fear. Martha said, "You need to go to the sheriff." Josie said, "The sheriff works for Crane." Martha said, "Not all of him. There's a deputy, name of Carver. He's a good man. He was out here before, wasn't he?" Josie nodded. Martha said, "Go to him. File a report. Make it official. Even if nothing comes of it, it puts Crane on notice that you're not going to be silent about this." Josie looked at her. She said, "Will it make a difference?" Martha said, "It might not, but it's the right thing to do." Josie said, "The right thing hasn't done me much good so far." Martha looked at the burning barn. Then she looked back at Josie. She said, "You're still standing. That's something." She climbed back onto her wagon. She said, "I'll send word if I hear anything." Then she drove away. The neighbors left one by one. Josie stood alone in the yard. The smoke rose into the night sky, dirty and dark. The stars were hidden behind it. She could hear the horses at the creek, their nervous stamping, their low whickers. She could hear Sam crying inside the house. She could hear her own heart beating in her ears. Silas came up beside her. He did not touch her. He just stood there. She could smell the smoke on him, the charred leather of his coat, the burnt hair from his arms. He said, "I'm sorry." She said, "For what?" He said, "I couldn't save it all." She looked at him. His face was gray with exhaustion. There was a burn on his forearm, red and angry. She said, "You saved the horses. That's more than I asked for." He said, "It's not enough." She said, "I know." They stood together in the dark. The embers glowed. The smoke drifted. She thought about the man who had set the fire. She thought about the man who had walked into it. She thought about the months ahead, the cold, the hunger, the weight of everything she had to carry. She thought about giving up. The thought was there, briefly, like a shadow passing over the ground, and then it was gone. She had not survived this long to give up now. She said, "I'm going to town tomorrow. I'm going to file a report, and then I'm going to find a way to keep going. He said, I'll come with you. She said, I know you will. They went inside. The house felt different, smaller, the walls pressing in. The children were gathered in the main room, Hattie sitting with them on the floor, her face drawn and pale. Bertie was asleep in her arms. Sam was curled against her side, his face streaked with tears. Clementine sat apart, her knees pulled to her chest, her dark eyes fixed on the door. When Josie came in, she looked up. She said, Did they get the horses? Josie said, Yes, sweetheart, they got the horses. Clementine nodded. She did not ask anything else, but she moved closer to Silas when he sat down, close enough that her shoulder touched his. He did not move away. The night was long. Josie did not sleep. She sat at the table with the lamp burning low, staring at the wall. She thought about Thomas. She thought about the life they had planned. She thought about all the ways it had gone wrong. She thought about the fire, the heat, the moment she had seen Silas disappear into the smoke. She had thought he was going to die. She had felt something break inside her at that thought. She did not want to examine what that meant. She was not ready. In the morning she went to town. Silas went with her. They rode in silence, the bay mare and the roan, side by side. The sun was pale behind the clouds. The road was dusty. The town was quiet when they arrived, hitching their horses outside the sheriff's office. Deputy Carver was at the desk. He looked up when they came in, and his face told her that he had already heard. He said, Mrs. Hale, I'm sorry about your barn. She said, I need to file a report. He said, I figured. He pulled out a paper and a pen. He asked her to describe what happened. She did. He wrote it down. He asked if she had any idea who set the fire. She said she did. He asked who. She said, Virgil Crane. He stopped writing. He looked at her. He said, Do you have proof? She said, No, but I know. He said, That's not going to hold up in court. She said, I know that too, but I want it on record. I want it known that I'm not going to be quiet about what's happening to me. Carver looked at her for a long moment. Then he wrote something down. He said, You're right to do this. It may not change anything, but you're right. He signed the paper and stamped it and handed her a copy. He said, If anything else happens, you come to me, not to the sheriff, to me. She said, I will. She folded the paper and put it in her pocket. She turned to go. Carver said, Mrs. Hale. She stopped. He said, There are people in this town who want to see you make it. You're not alone. She looked at him. She said, Thank you. Then she walked out. They rode home in the afternoon light. The sky had cleared. The valley was spread out before them, golden and green, beautiful in a way that hurt. She looked at the land she had fought for, the land that was trying to break her, and she felt something settle in her chest. She did not know if it was strength or stubbornness. She did not care. It was enough to keep moving. When they got back, Ezra was waiting at the gate. He had something in his hand, a piece of paper pinned to the porch door. He handed it to her. It was a note, written in a steady hand. It said, Next time, it won't be the barn. She read it twice. She felt the cold settle into her bones. Silas took it from her and read it. His jaw tightened. He said, He's trying to frighten you. She said, He's succeeding. He said, He's trying to make you leave. She said, I know. He looked at her. He said, Are you going to? She looked at the note. She looked at her children in the doorway. She looked at the man who had walked through fire to save her horses. She said, No, I'm not going anywhere. She went inside. She made dinner. She sat with her children and ate. She put them to bed. She checked the locks. She stood at the window and looked out at the dark, at the place where the barn had been, at the stars that the smoke had hidden the night before. She thought about the note. She thought about the fire. She thought about the man who had started it, the man who thought he could break her. She felt Silas behind her before he spoke. He said, I'm going to stand watch tonight. She said, You need to rest. He said, So do you. She said, I'll rest when this is over. He said, Then neither of us will rest for a while. She turned to look at him. The lamplight caught his face, the lines of exhaustion, the shadows under his eyes. She said, What if he's right? What if he can break us? He said, He can break the barn, he can break the fence, he can break the well. But he can't break you. I've been watching you for weeks. I've seen what you do when the world falls apart. You don't break, you bend, but you don't break." She looked at him. She said, "How do you know that?" He said, "Because I've seen broken people. I was one of them. You're not broken, Josie. You're the strongest woman I've ever met." She did not know what to say. The words sat in her chest, warm and heavy. She held his gaze. She said, "You're not broken either." He said, "I'm working on it." She almost smiled. She said, "We both are." They stood together in the quiet. The house settled around them. Somewhere in the back room, Bertie murmured in her sleep. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods. The night was deep and dark and full of threats, but she was not alone. She had never been more aware of that than in this moment. She said, "Get some sleep. I'll take the first watch." He started to argue. She cut him off. She said, "You walked into a burning barn. You get 3 hours of sleep. I'll wake you." He looked at her for a moment, then he nodded. He said, 3 hours. She said, 3 hours. He went to his cot by the stove. She sat in the chair by the window, the rifle across her knees. The stars were bright. The moon was thin. She watched the darkness and thought about the morning. She thought about the days ahead. She thought about the note, the threat, the shadow that was gathering around her home. She thought about Silas, asleep in her kitchen. She thought about her children, asleep in their beds. She held the rifle, and she watched the dark. And she did not let herself think about what it meant that she was no longer afraid of what might come, because she knew whatever it was, she would face it. The hours passed. The moon crossed the sky. The wind died. She heard an owl. She heard the horses shifting in the makeshift corral by the creek. She heard nothing else. No footsteps. No whispers. The night was still. When the first light began to touch the horizon, she finally let herself breathe. She set the rifle down. She rubbed her eyes. She went to the kitchen and started the coffee. Silas woke when she struck the match. He sat up, his eyes finding her immediately. She said, "It was quiet." He said, "Good." She handed him a cup. He took it. Their fingers touched. Neither of them pulled away. The sun rose, slow and golden, over the valley. The land was beautiful. The land was hard. They sat together in the light of a new day, and they did not talk about what was coming. They did not need to. They both knew. The war was not over, but they were still standing, and that was something. The morning after the barn burned, the valley was quiet in a way that felt like holding your breath. Josie stood in the yard and looked at what was left. A blackened skeleton of timbers, the stone foundation still standing, the iron hinges of the door twisted and warped by the heat. The smell of smoke was thick in the air, clinging to everything. Her clothes, her hair, the inside of her mouth. She had not slept. She had sat in the chair by the window all night with the rifle across her knees, watching the dark, waiting for another attack that did not come. But the waiting had hollowed her out. She walked through the ruins. Her boots crunched on charred wood and ash. She found the remains of the harness, the metal buckles fused together, the leather gone. She found the melted remains of a lantern. She found the iron rim of a wheel that had been leaning against the wall, now a blackened ring in the ash. She did not find anything she could salvage. The barn had been full of the tools of her life, the accumulated necessities of a working homestead, and all of it was gone. Ezra came up behind her. His voice was rough. He said, "Mama, we need to talk about what we're going to do." She turned. His face was streaked with soot, his eyes red from the smoke and from something else. She said, "We rebuild." He said, "With what?" "The winter feed was in that barn. The tools, the tack, the supplies. We don't have the money to replace any of it." She said, "We'll find a way." He said, "How?" She did not have an answer. She stood in the ash and felt the weight of the question pressing down on her. She thought about the note pinned to her door. She thought about the man who had set the fire, the man who was probably watching from somewhere right now, waiting to see her break. She said, "We find a way because there is no other option." Ezra looked at her. He was 15 years old and he looked 40. He said, "I know." He did not argue. He turned and walked back toward the house. She watched him go and felt the distance between them, the thing that grief and hardship had carved out. She did not know how to close it. Silas found her an hour later. He had been down at the creek, checking on the horses. He came up with a bucket of water and a rag and said, "You need to wash your face." She said, "I need a lot of things." He set the bucket down and dipped the rag and wrung it out. He handed it to her. She took it. The water was cold. She pressed the rag to her face and felt the soot come off, the grime of the night before. She handed it back. She said, "Thank you." He said, "We need to talk about winter." She said, "I know." He said, "The hay that was in the barn, that was half of what you needed. We can cut more from the north meadow, but it's late in the season. The grass is already going to seed. It won't be as good, but it'll be something." She said, "We need a barn before winter." He said, "We can build a lean-to against the house. It won't hold all the horses, but it'll hold the milk cow and the gelding. The others can stay in the south pasture if we reinforce the fence." She said, "That's not a barn." He said, "No, it's not." She looked at the ruins. She thought about the work ahead, the months of labor, the cost of lumber and nails. She said, "I don't know if I can do this." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You don't have to do it alone." She looked at him. His gray eyes were steady. There was a burn on his forearm from the fire, red and raw, and he had not mentioned it once. She said, "You've already done more than anyone could ask." He said, "I'm not doing it because I was asked." She did not know what to say to that. She looked away. The sun was climbing, burning off the morning chill. The valley was golden. The creek was running clear. The world was beautiful and brutal and demanding. She said, "I need to go into town. I need to see about getting lumber." He said, "I'll go with you." They rode in together, leaving Ezra with the rifle and instructions to keep the children inside. The town was quiet. The streets were dusty. People looked at her as she passed. Some looked away quickly. Some nodded. She felt the weight of their gazes, the knowledge that everyone knew what had happened. Everyone was watching to see what she would do. She went to the lumber yard first. The man behind the counter was named Felder. He had known Thomas. He had bought hay from them 2 summers ago. She told him what she needed. He wrote down the numbers, and then he looked at her and said, "Mrs. Hale, I can't extend credit right now. The bank's tightened up. I'm sorry." She said, "I understand." She turned to go. He said, "Wait." She stopped. He reached under the counter and pulled out a small box. He said, "There's some nails and a few lengths of good oak in the back. It's not much. It's not enough for a barn, but it might help with the lean-to." He pushed the box across the counter. He said, "No charge." She said, "I can't accept that." He said, "You can and you will. Thomas was a good man. He helped me when my wife was sick. This is me paying it forward." She looked at the box. She said, "Thank you." He said, "Don't thank me yet. You just keep standing." She carried the box out to the wagon. Silas was waiting. He took it from her and set it in the bed. He said, "One step at a time." She said, "That's what I keep telling myself." They were about to leave when a rider came up fast, a young man on a lathered horse. He pulled up short and looked at Silas with an expression Josie could not read. He said, "Captain Wade?" Silas went very still. He said, "I'm not a captain anymore." The young man said, "I've been looking for you for 3 months. My name is Caleb Moore. I served under you at the field hospital." Silas looked at him. Something passed across his face, recognition and something else. He said, "I remember you. You were the boy who held the tourniquet on Sergeant Miller's leg." Caleb nodded. He said, "You saved his life." He looked at Josie, then back at Silas. He said, "I have news. Can we talk somewhere private?" They found a bench outside the mercantile. The sun was hot. The street was quiet. Caleb spoke quickly, as if he was afraid of running out of time. He said, "Colonel Hall sent me. He said to tell you that Greer's son, the officer who filed the desertion charge, has been making threats. He's been telling people that you ruined his father's reputation, that you caused his death. He's been asking around about where you are. I don't think he knows about the warrant being overturned. I think he's looking for vengeance." Silas was silent. His face had gone hard, the stillness that came over him when he was processing something dangerous. He said, "How did you find me?" Caleb said, "Hole told me about the woman in Montana, the one who helped you. He said you might be out this way. I've been riding from town to town for weeks. I was in Billings when I heard about the fire. I figured that might be you." He paused. He said, "Hole also said to tell you that your back pay from the Army came through. The overturned warrant meant the pay was reinstated for the years you were gone. It's sitting in a bank in Miles City. It's enough to rebuild a barn." Josie felt the words land like stones. She looked at Silas. His mouth was a tight line. He said, "I don't want that money." Caleb said, "It's yours. It's been yours for 20 years. You earned it." Silas said, "I earned it doing things I don't want to remember." Caleb said, "You also earned it saving lives. Sergeant Miller is alive because of you. 43 civilians are alive because of you. That money is not blood money. It's life money." Silas did not answer. He stared at the ground for a long moment. Then he stood. He said, "Thank you for riding out here. You should get some rest before you head back." Caleb said, "I'm not heading back. I came to help." Silas looked at him. Caleb said, "I owe you. Let me help rebuild the barn. I'm good with my hands." Silas looked at Josie. She said, "We can use the help." They rode back to the homestead with Caleb following behind on his tired horse. The wagon was loaded with the box of nails and oak from Felder and the promise of money in Miles City that Silas had not yet agreed to claim. Josie watched him from the corner of her eye. He was staring straight ahead, his jaw tight, his hands loose on the reins. She did not push him. She knew that silence was how he wrestled with things. She let him wrestle. The afternoon was spent clearing the barn site. Caleb worked alongside Silas and Ezra, hauling blackened timbers, piling the debris for disposal. He was a quiet young man, not much older than Ezra, with a shock of dark hair and a habit of humming while he worked. He did not ask questions about the fire or about Crane. He simply showed up and started working, and Josie was grateful for that. Hattie brought water out to the men. She looked at Caleb with the careful assessment she gave all strangers. He caught her looking and said, "Thank you, miss." She nodded and went back inside. Josie saw the exchange and filed it away. That evening, after dinner, Clementine did something she had never done before. She walked up to Silas, who was sitting on the porch steps, and she held out a piece of paper. She had folded it carefully, like a letter. He took it. He opened it. He read it. His face did not change, but something in his eyes softened. He looked at her. He said, "Thank you." She nodded. She turned and went back inside. Josie watched from the doorway. She was curious about what the note said, but she knew better than to ask. Some things were private between people. She understood that. Later, after the children were asleep, she sat beside Silas on the porch. The stars were out. The air was cool. She said, "What did it say?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It said, 'Thank you for saving the horses. I was afraid they would die. You made them safe.'" He paused. He said, "She signed it with her name." Josie felt the tears press against the back of her eyes. She blinked them away. She said, "That's the first time she's written anything in 7 months." He said, "I know." They sat in the quiet. The creek murmured in the distance. An owl called. She said, "You should take the money." He was silent. She said, "I know it's complicated. I know it comes with a past you don't want to touch. But you can use it to build something good, something that matters." He said, "The money was paid by an army that used me and threw me away." She said, "The money was paid for the years of your life that you gave to that army. It's yours. You don't have to forgive them to take what you earned." He looked at her. His gray eyes were unreadable in the dark. He said, "You sound like you've thought about this." She said, "I've thought about a lot of things these past weeks." He said, "If I take the money, it means I'm staying." She said, "I know." He said, "It means I'm not just passing through. I'm becoming part of this place." She said, "I know." He looked at the sky. The stars were cold and bright. He said, "I haven't belonged anywhere in a long time." She said, "Neither have I. Not really. Not since Thomas died." She said it quietly. She said, "I've been surviving. That's different from living." He turned to look at her. He said, "I know the difference." She said, "I thought you might." They did not say anything else. They sat together in the dark, and the distance between them was smaller than it had ever been. She felt the warmth of his shoulder near hers, the solid presence of him. She did not move closer. She did not pull away. She let herself be there, in the moment, with the stars and the crickets and the man who had walked through fire. The next morning, Silas rode to Miles City. He took Caleb with him, and the bay mare, and the letter from the bank. He was gone 3 days. Those were the longest 3 days Josie had lived through since the night of the storm. She threw herself into the work, clearing the barn site, mending the fence, hauling water from the creek. The children helped. Hattie took over the cooking. Ezra worked beside her without speaking. Clementine sat with Bertie and Sam, reading aloud from a worn copy of a storybook, her voice growing stronger with each page. On the third evening, Josie saw the dust on the road. She walked to the gate and waited. The wagon came into view, loaded with lumber. Good lumber, not the scrap and salvaged pieces she had expected. Long planks of pine, beams of oak, a roll of roofing felt, a box of nails so heavy it took 2 men to lift it. Silas was driving the wagon. Caleb was beside him. Behind them, tied to the back, was a milk cow, a good one, with a full udder and a calm eye. Silas pulled up at the gate. He looked at her. He said, "I took the money." She said, "I see that." He said, "I bought lumber for the barn. And a cow. Because you need milk, and Bertie needs milk, and Sam drinks it like he's never going to see it again." She laughed. It was a surprised sound, a sound she had not made in a long time. She said, "You bought a cow." He said, "I bought a cow." He climbed down from the wagon. He was tired, the lines deep in his face, but there was something different in his eyes, something lighter. She said, "Thank you." He said, "It's not charity, it's an investment." She said, "In what?" He looked at her. He said, "In a future." She did not say anything. The word hung between them, heavy and precious. She helped him unhitch the horses. Caleb led the cow to the makeshift pen. The sun was going down, painting the valley gold. She stood in the yard with the lumber and the cow and the man who had come back, and she let herself feel something she had not let herself feel in a long time. Hope. The next week was a blur of work. The barn went up fast, the frame rising from the ashes, the walls going up board by board. Neighbors came to help. Martha Pendleton brought a wagon of food, enough to feed the crew for a week. Deputy Carver came on his day off and spent the afternoon hammering nails. Even Felder from the lumberyard showed up with a box of roofing shingles and a shy nod. Crane must have heard. He must have been watching. But no one came to stop them. No fires, no notes. The silence was unsettling, but Josie did not let herself dwell on it. She kept working, kept moving, kept building. On the last day, when the roof was on and the doors were hung, Silas stood back and looked at the new barn. It was not as big as the old one. It was simpler, rougher, but it was solid. It would hold. Josie came up beside him. She said, "It looks good." He said, "It's a start." She said, "It's more than a start. It's a new beginning." He looked at her. The sun was behind her, catching the edges of her hair. He said, "I think I'm starting to believe that." She said, "Good, because I'm not stopping now." That night, they had a small celebration. Hattie made a pie from the berries she had picked. Sam told a story about an outlaw that lasted 45 minutes and involved at least 5 horses and a talking dog. Clementine sat beside Silas at the table. She did not speak, but she leaned against his arm, and he let her. Bertie fell asleep in Josie's lap, her breath warm and steady. After the children were in bed, Josie walked out to the new barn. The moon was full, casting silver light across the yard. She stood in the doorway and looked at the empty stalls, the clean floor, the smell of new wood. She heard footsteps behind her. She did not turn. She said, "I don't know how to thank you." Silas said, "You don't have to." She said, "I want to." He came up beside her. He stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. She said, "I was afraid you wouldn't come back." He said, "I told you I was staying." She said, "I know, but I was still afraid." He said, "I was afraid too, of what it would mean to come back, of what I was choosing." She turned to face him. The moonlight caught his face, the lines, the shadows. She said, "What did you choose?" He looked at her. His gray eyes were steady. He said, "I chose to stop running. I chose to build something instead of leaving it behind. I chose you." The word hung in the air. She felt it land in her chest, warm and heavy and terrifying. She said, "Silas." He said, "I know it's too soon. I know you have 5 children and a homestead to run and a fight that's not over. I know I'm not the man you expected to walk into your life. But I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him. She thought about the storm, the wound, the night she had sat on the floor with Bertie while he talked her through the steam. She thought about the fire, the horses, the way he had walked into the flames and come out with them alive. She thought about the barn rising from the ashes. She thought about the word future. She said, "I don't know what I'm doing." He said, "Neither do I." She said, "That's the scariest thing I've ever heard." He said, "It's the truest thing I've ever said." She reached out. She took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm and calloused and steady. They stood in the doorway of the new barn, under the full moon, and they did not let go. Around them, the valley stretched out, dark and vast and full of threat. But in that moment, there was only the warmth of his hand and the beating of her own heart, and the knowledge that she was not alone, not anymore. In the distance, beyond the cottonwoods, a shape moved in the darkness, a rider watching from the ridge. Josie did not see him, but he was there, and in his hand he held a piece of paper with an address in Miles City and a name that was not Silas Wade. The war was not over. It was only changing shape. The morning after the barn raising, Josie woke to the sound of hammering. She lay still for a moment, disoriented, and then remembered. The new barn, the moonlit hand, the warmth of Silas's fingers around hers. She pressed her palm to her chest and felt the shape of it, the thing that had shifted in the night. She did not have words for it. She was not sure she wanted them. She dressed and went outside. The sun was just clearing the ridge, casting long shadows across the yard. Silas was already at work, framing a new stall in the barn. His sleeves were rolled up, and she could see the burn on his forearm, healing now, pink and tight. He looked up when she came in and nodded. She nodded back. That was enough. Caleb was there too, hauling scraps from the old barn to a burn pile. He had been staying in the barn, sleeping on a bed of hay, and he had become a fixture in the rhythm of the household. Sam followed him everywhere, asking questions about the war and the army, and whether he had ever killed a bear. Caleb had answered each question with patient seriousness, even the bears. It was Hattie who brought the news. She had ridden into town for supplies, a routine errand that had become part of the new normal. But when she came back, her face was pale, and she did not dismount immediately. She sat in the saddle, looking at the house, looking at the new barn, as if she was trying to memorize it. Josie walked out to meet her. Hattie said, "Mama, there's a man in town. He's asking questions about Silas. Not the same questions as before. He's not a deputy. He's not from here. He's wearing a suit, and he talks like he's from back east. He was at the hotel, showing a photograph around. It was Silas." She paused. "Mama, he's offering a reward for information. $500. The same amount as the warrant, but this is different. He said he wants to find Silas for personal reasons." Josie felt the cold settle into her bones. She said, "Did anyone tell him anything?" Hattie said, "Not yet, but he's been talking to Crane's men." She looked at her mother. She said, "I think Crane sent for him." The morning fractured. Josie sent Caleb to find Silas, who was down at the creek checking the fence. She brought the children inside and barred the door. She stood at the window and watched the road, waiting for a rider that did not come. Hours passed. The sun climbed and then began to descend. No one came. Silas returned at dusk. He had heard the news from Caleb. His face was hard, the stillness back in full force. He did not say anything at first. He sat down at the kitchen table and stared at the wall. Josie set a cup of coffee in front of him. He did not touch it. She sat down across from him and waited. Finally, he spoke. He said, "Greer's son, the one Hall warned about. He's found me." She said, "You don't know that for certain." He said, Who else would offer a reward for me? The army cleared my name. The warrant is dead. This is personal." He paused. He said, "Greer had 2 sons. One died at Antietam. The other was a clerk in his father's office. He was the one who typed up the desertion charge. He knew it was a lie. He typed it anyway." Josie said, "What does he want?" Silas looked at her. His gray eyes were flat. He said, "He wants to finish what his father started. He wants to see me dead or in prison. He wants to prove that the desertion charge was true, that the civilians I saved don't matter, that I'm a criminal. He wants to destroy everything I've built." He paused. "Everything I've built since I met you." The words hung in the air. She said, "You haven't built anything since you met me. We built it together." He looked at her. Something moved in his face. He said, "That's what he wants to take." The next morning, a rider came to the gate. It was not Greer's son. It was a man Josie did not recognize, middle-aged, with a weathered face and the easy seat of a lifelong horseman. He dismounted and held up his hands to show he was unarmed. He said, "I'm looking for Silas Wade. My name is Henry Porter. I served with him in the 13th. I heard he was in trouble." Silas came out of the barn. He stopped when he saw the man. The two of them looked at each other for a long moment. Then Porter said, "You look like hell." Silas said, "You look like you've been sleeping in a ditch." Porter laughed. It was a rough sound, genuine. He said, "I have been." He crossed the yard and clasped Silas's arm. He said, "I came as soon as I heard. Marcus Hull sent word that Greer's boy was on the move. I figured you could use a hand." Silas said, "I don't want to drag anyone else into this." Porter said, "You're not dragging me. I'm walking in on my own." He looked at the new barn. He said, "Nice place." Silas said, "It's not mine." Porter looked at Josie. He said, "Ma'am." She said, "Welcome." Porter stayed. He was a quiet man, practical, with a gift for fixing things. He patched a leak in the kitchen roof that had been dripping for months. He sharpened the plow blade. He told stories about the war that made Silas laugh, a quiet, rusty sound that Josie had never heard before. She watched him relax, just a fraction, and she felt grateful for Henry Porter. But the threat did not go away. 3 days later, a letter arrived. It was addressed to Silas, care of the Hail homestead. The handwriting was precise, cold, the hand of a man who had learned to write in a school that taught discipline and control. Silas opened it at the kitchen table. Josie watched his face as he read. It did not change. He set the letter down. He said, "It's from Greer's son. His name is Edmund. He says he knows I'm here. He says he has filed a motion to reopen the desertion charge based on new evidence. He says the evidence is a sworn statement from a former orderly who claims he saw me abandon my post." He paused. He said, "The orderly is lying, but it's his word against mine. And he has the backing of the Greer family name." Josie said, "Can he do that? Reopen a case that was already cleared?" Silas said, "He can try. The military courts are slow. He's hoping to drag it out long enough that I'll be forced to surrender myself for a hearing. If I don't, I'll be declared a fugitive. If I do, I'll be arrested and held until the hearing." He said, "Either way, he wins." The silence stretched around them. The kitchen was warm, the fire crackling. Outside, Sam was chasing the chickens, his laughter floating through the open window. The world was ordinary and beautiful and full of things worth protecting. And it was all under threat. Ezra had come in during the conversation. He stood in the doorway, his arms crossed, his face carved from stone. He said, "So we run?" Silas said, "I can't run. If I run, he'll go after the people who helped me. He'll come after you." Ezra said, "Then we fight." Silas said, "Fight how? With what? He has the law on his side. He has money. He has Crane. I have a burned barn and a few good friends." Ezra looked at his mother. He said, "Mama?" She looked at Silas. She said, "We do what we've always done. We keep going. We find a way through." She looked at the letter. She said, "How long do we have?" Silas said, "A week, maybe less. He'll want to move before the hearing is scheduled. He'll want to take me by surprise." She said, then we don't get surprised. The next 4 days were a blur of preparation. Silas did not hide. He worked openly, repairing the fence, hauling water, splitting wood. But he was watchful. He kept his rifle close. He slept in the barn, not the house, so that if anyone came, they would find him first. Josie argued with him about it. He did not change his mind. Caleb and Porter took turns on watch, stationed at the ridge, hidden among the rocks, watching the road. They reported nothing unusual, but the silence itself felt like a threat, the calm before a blow. On the 5th morning, Josie woke before dawn and found Clementine standing at her bedside. Her daughter's face was pale, her dark eyes fixed on her mother. She said, "Mama, I had a dream." Josie sat up. She said, "What kind of dream?" Clementine said, "A man came to the house. He had a gun. He was looking for Silas." She paused. She said, "He had a scar on his hand, like this." She traced a line across the back of her own hand. She said, "I saw it in the dream. He was angry." Josie took her daughter's hand. She said, "It was just a dream, sweetheart." Clementine shook her head. She said, "No, it wasn't." Her voice was small but certain. She said, "I see things sometimes. I saw Papa fall. I saw it before it happened. And I saw this man. He's coming today." Josie felt the blood drain from her face. She held Clementine's hand and tried to breathe. She said, "Did you see anything else?" Clementine said, "He's bringing 2 men. They're coming from the east, along the ridge. They'll be here by noon." Josie got up. She dressed. She went to the barn and found Silas. She told him what Clementine had said. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "The girl has been through a lot. She may be imagining." She said, "She saw her father die. She hasn't spoken in 7 months. She's not imagining." He looked at her. He said, "If she's right, we need to be ready." She said, "I know." They prepared. The children were moved to the root cellar, a small, dark space beneath the house that had been dug years ago to store potatoes and preserves. Hattie went with them, carrying a rifle and a lantern. Bertie was crying. Sam was asking questions. Clementine was silent, her face composed, as if she had already seen the outcome and was waiting for the world to catch up. Josie stood on the porch. Silas stood beside her. They did not speak. They watched the eastern ridge, the line of cottonwoods, the open sky. The sun climbed, the wind blew, the minutes passed. At 1:15 Silas said, "There!" She followed his gaze. 3 riders coming over the ridge. They were moving steadily, not fast, not slow. They knew where they were going. Josie's hand tightened on the rifle. Silas said, "Stay behind me." She said, "I'm not staying behind anyone." He looked at her. He said, "I know." The riders came down the slope and through the gate. The man in front was young, not more than 30, with sharp features and cold eyes. He wore a dark suit and a hat that shaded his face. He stopped his horse 20 feet from the porch and looked at Silas with the kind of hatred that had been polished over years into something clean and precise. He said, "Captain Wade, I've been looking for you." Silas said, "Edmund." Edmund Greer dismounted. His men stayed on their horses, their hands resting on their hips. He looked at the house, the barn, the garden. He said, "You've made yourself a nice life here, hiding out on a widow's property, using her to shield you." He looked at Josie. He said, "Do you know what kind of man you're harboring, ma'am? He's a deserter, a coward who abandoned his post while his men died." Silas said, "That's not what happened." Edmund said, "I have a sworn statement that says it is." Silas said, "Your father filed false charges to cover his own incompetence. You know it. You typed the paperwork." Edmund said, "My father was a loyal officer who was destroyed by your lies. He died a broken man because of what you did." Silas said, "He died because he couldn't live with what he'd done. Not because of me." Edmund took a step forward. He was not armed, at least not visibly, but his hands were clenched at his sides. He said, "I'm here to give you a choice. You can come with me peacefully, surrender yourself for a new military hearing, and face whatever justice decides. Or you can stay here, and I'll have you arrested as a fugitive. I have a warrant." He held up a folded paper. Silas looked at the warrant. He looked at Edmund. He said, That warrant has no standing. My name was cleared." Edmund said, "It was cleared by a corrupt judge who was a friend of Marcus Hall. I have evidence that the original investigation was tainted. The hearing was a sham." Silas was quiet. Josie could feel the tension in him, the control he was exerting over himself. He said, "You're going to destroy the life I've built here, whatever happens. Even if I go with you, you'll make sure I never come back. That's what you want." Edmund said, "I want justice for my father." Silas said, "You want revenge." The word hung in the air. Edmund's jaw tightened. He said, "Call it what you like. You have 5 minutes to decide." Josie stepped forward. She said, "He's not going with you." Edmund looked at her. He said, "This is not your concern, ma'am." She said, "It is my concern. This man is part of my family. He saved my daughter's life. He built that barn with his own hands. He's not a deserter. He's not a coward. And you're not taking him." Edmund looked at her. He said, "Ma'am, you're making a mistake." She said, "I've been making decisions for my family for a year. I've made mistakes. This is not one of them." Behind her, she heard the door open. She turned. Ezra was standing there, holding his father's rifle. His face was pale, but his hands were steady. Behind him, Hattie emerged from the root cellar, a pistol in her hand, and behind her, Clementine. She was not carrying a weapon. She was carrying nothing. But she walked past her siblings and stood beside her mother, and she looked at Edmund Greer with eyes that did not blink. Edmund looked at the children. He looked at Silas. He looked at Josie. He said, "You're willing to let your children fight for a man you barely know?" She said, "I know him. That's enough." The silence stretched. Edmund's men shifted in their saddles. Edmund's hand moved toward his coat. Silas stepped forward, placing himself between Josie and the man. He said, "Edmund, this ends here. Not with blood, not with more hate. You can walk away. You can choose to stop carrying this. I know what your father did. I know you know it too. You don't have to be him." Edmund's face twisted. He said, "You don't get to speak to me about my father." He pulled a revolver from his coat. The movement was fast, practiced. The barrel came up. Silas did not flinch. He stood still, looking at the man with something that was not fear. It was almost pity. The gunshot cracked across the yard. But it did not come from Edmund's gun. It came from the ridge. The bullet kicked up dust at Edmund's feet. He spun, looking up. On the ridge, a line of riders had appeared, 6 of them. In front, Marcus Hall, his rifle still raised. Beside him, Deputy Carver. And behind them, men Josie did not recognize, armed and watching. Hall called down. He said, "Edmund Greer, you are outnumbered, outgunned, and out of legal standing. The Federal Land Office has reviewed your petition. It's been denied. The desertion charge against Silas Wade is permanently sealed. Your father's record has been reviewed and amended to reflect the truth. You have no case. You have no warrant. You have nothing." Edmund stared up at the ridge. His hand was still on the revolver, but his face had gone gray. He looked at Silas. He said, "This isn't over." Silas said, "It is. You just don't want to see it." Hall and his men rode down the slope. Carver dismounted and walked to Edmund. He took the revolver from his hand. He said, "You're going to come with me. There's a telegraph from the territorial governor. Seems there are some questions about your conduct. You're going to answer them." Edmund did not resist. He looked at Silas one last time. Then he let Carver lead him away. The riders dispersed. Hall stayed. He stood in the yard looking at Silas. He said, "I told you I'd handle it." Silas said, "You nearly waited too long." Hall said, "I had to be sure." He looked at the new barn. He said, "You built this." Silas said, "We built it." Hall nodded. He looked at Josie. He said, "Ma'am." She said, "Thank you." He said, "Don't thank me. I owed him, and I pay my debts." He mounted his horse. He looked down at Silas. He said, "You're going to be all right, old friend." Silas said, "I know." Hall smiled, a rare thing. Then he turned his horse and rode away. The yard was quiet. The dust settled. Josie stood with her children around her, with Silas beside her, and she let herself breathe. The danger had passed. The sun was warm on her face. The barn stood solid and true. She looked at Silas. He was looking at the ridge where the riders had disappeared. He turned to her. He said, "It's over." She said, "I know." He said, "I think I can finally stop running." She took his hand. She did not say anything. She did not need to. The wind moved through the cottonwoods, and the water ran in the creek, and the house waited behind them, full of light and the sound of children. She held his hand, and she let herself believe that this was real, that it would last, that the long night was finally breaking into morning. The weeks that followed the confrontation with Edmund Greer were quiet in a way that felt foreign to Josie. She woke each morning and lay still for a moment, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for another threat to emerge from the horizon. But the horizon stayed empty. The road stayed quiet. The only sounds were the familiar ones: the chickens scratching in the yard, the creek running clear, the voices of her children rising and falling in the rhythm of ordinary life. The first snowfall came in early November, a light dusting that turned the valley white and softened the edges of the world. The children ran out to catch flakes on their tongues. Bertie, bundled in a coat that was too big for her, stood in the middle of the yard with her arms outstretched, spinning until she fell down in a heap of laughter. Sam tried to build a snowman but gave up after the head kept falling off, and declared that snow was overrated. Hattie rolled her eyes but helped him anyway. Josie stood on the porch and watched them. The cold bit at her cheeks, but she did not go inside. She wanted to hold the moment, to press it into her memory where it could not be taken from her. Beside her, Silas leaned against the porch post, a cup of coffee in his hands, watching the children with an expression she had come to recognize. It was the look of a man who was still learning to believe that he was allowed to be here, that he could stay. She said, "You're going to freeze standing there." He said, "I've been colder." She said, "That's not an answer." He looked at her. He said, "I'm fine." She let it go. She had learned that some of his answers were not about the question. They were about the space between them, the thing they were both circling but had not yet named. She did not push. She had learned patience from the land, from the long months of waiting for things to grow, for wounds to heal, for the storm to pass. She could wait for him. That evening, after dinner, she found Clementine in the back room, sitting by the window. The snow was falling again, heavier now, blanketing the yard. Clementine had a small piece of wood in her hands, a scrap from the barn building, and she was carving it with a pocket knife Josie had never seen before. Josie said, "Where did you get that?" Clementine said, "Silas gave it to me. He said I should have something to do with my hands." She held up the wood. It was taking the shape of a bird, wings folded, head turned. She said, "It's going to be a swallow." Josie sat down beside her. She said, "It's beautiful." Clementine said, "It's not finished." She went back to carving, her small hands moving with a confidence that surprised her mother. Josie watched her. 7 months of silence. 7 months of watching the world through a window. And now, a knife and a piece of wood and the shape of a bird emerging from her hands. She said, "I'm proud of you." Clementine did not look up. She said, "I know." But her voice was soft, and the corner of her mouth lifted. Winter settled in earnest. The days grew short and cold. The creek froze at the edges. The cattle huddled in the south pasture, their breath pluming in the air. Josie and Silas worked together to reinforce the lean-to, banking hay against the walls, making sure the horses had shelter from the wind. Porter had left, heading south before the snow closed the passes. Caleb stayed, helping with the chores, filling the silence with his quiet humming. Ezra had changed. It was subtle, the way a river changes course, slowly and then all at once. He no longer watched Silas with suspicion. He no longer positioned himself between Silas and the door. He asked his advice, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. One evening, Josie saw them sitting at the table together, a map spread out between them, discussing where to plant the spring crop. Ezra was leaning forward, listening. Silas was talking, his finger tracing a line on the map. It was an ordinary scene. It was extraordinary. She did not interrupt. She stood in the doorway and let herself feel it, the slow knitting together of something that had been broken. Her son had a father again. Not Thomas, never Thomas, but someone. A man who was teaching him how to read the land, how to plan for the future, how to be steady when the world shook. She turned away before they saw her crying. Christmas came and went. Martha Pendleton sent a basket of gifts, dried fruit and a small sack of sugar and a length of red ribbon that Hattie immediately braided into her hair. The children made decorations from paper and pine cones. Sam asked Silas to carve him a horse, and Silas did, a small wooden figure that Sam carried everywhere and slept with under his pillow. On Christmas evening, after the children were in bed, Josie and Silas sat by the fire. The house was warm. The wind was howling outside, but inside, the fire crackled and the lamp burned low. She said, "This is the first Christmas I've felt like celebrating in a long time." He said, "Me too." She looked at him. She said, "You've stayed." He said, "I told you I would." She said, "I know, but I didn't know if you would." He looked at the fire. He said, "I made a promise to myself when I fell off that horse in your yard. I told myself that if I survived, I would stop running. I didn't know what that meant. I thought it meant staying in one place. But it's more than that. It's staying with people. It's letting them stay with you." She said, "Are you staying with me?" He looked at her. The firelight caught his face. He said, "Yes." She said, "For how long?" He said, "For as long as you'll have me." She reached out and took his hand. It was warm, calloused, steady. She said, "That might be a very long time." He said, "I'm counting on it." Spring came slowly that year, the snow melting in fits and starts, the ground turning to mud and then to green. The creek swelled with runoff, and the sound of it filled the valley day and night. The children shed their coats and ran barefoot through the wet grass. Birdie grew an inch and lost her baby fat, turning into a lean, energetic child who followed her mother everywhere and asked endless questions. Caleb left in March, heading west to find work in the timber camps. He shook Silas's hand and said, "If you ever need me, send word." Silas nodded. He said, "I will." Then Caleb mounted his horse and rode out of the yard, and the family was smaller again, but not empty. The planting season began. Silas and Ezra worked the fields from dawn to dusk. Hattie managed the garden. Clementine spent her afternoons by the creek, carving. She had finished the swallow and started a larger piece, a horse rearing, its mane flying. She did not show it to anyone until it was done. When she finally brought it to the dinner table and set it in the center, the whole family went quiet. It was beautiful, the lines clean and alive, the wood polished smooth. Josie picked it up. She said, "When did you learn to do this?" Clementine said, "Silas taught me." Josie looked at Silas. He shrugged, but he was smiling. She said, "You've been keeping secrets." He said, "I've been keeping a few." The spring brought news from town. Virgil Crane had sold his water rights and moved to Denver. His lawyers had withdrawn the appeal. The legal threat was over. Josie heard it from Martha Pendleton, who brought the news herself, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee and a satisfied smile. She said, "He finally figured out he couldn't break you, so he went looking for easier pickings." Josie said, "I didn't break him." Martha said, "You outlasted him. That's the same thing." The summer came hot and dry. The creek ran low but did not dry up. The cattle grew fat on the pasture. The garden produced more than they could eat, and Hattie spent her afternoons canning tomatoes and beans and corn. The pantry filled. The root cellar was stocked. For the first time since Thomas died, Josie looked at the winter ahead and did not feel afraid. On a warm evening in July, she sat on the porch with Silas. The sun was going down, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The children were playing in the yard, their voices carrying on the still air. Clementine was sitting on the step below them, carving a new piece, her hair falling across her face. Birdie was chasing fireflies. Sam was telling Ezra a story that involved a very large bear and a very small dog. Hattie was reading on the swing, her lips moving silently. Josie said, "I think we're going to be all right." Silas said, "I think we already are." She looked at him. His gray eyes were on the horizon, but his hand found hers on the arm of the chair. She laced her fingers through his. She said, "I never thought I would feel this way again." He said, "Neither did I." She said, "I'm glad you fell off your horse in my yard." He laughed, a low, warm sound. He said, "I'm glad I did too." They sat together as the light faded and the stars came out. The children came inside one by one, eyelids heavy, cheeks flushed from the heat. Josie put them to bed, kissing each forehead, pulling the blankets up. When she came back out, Silas was still on the porch. She sat down beside him. She said, "I want to tell you something." He looked at her. She said, "I love you." The words hung in the air. She had not planned them. They had come out on their own, rising from the place where she had been holding them for months. She watched his face. He was still for a long moment. Then he said, "I love you too." He said it quietly, like a man saying something he had been afraid to say, and was relieved to have finally spoken. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The night was warm. The crickets were singing. The world was beautiful and fragile and full of grace. She closed her eyes and let herself rest. The summer passed. The harvest came. The barn filled with hay. The root cellar was stocked. The children grew. Silas became a part of the land, his hands shaping it, his presence woven into the rhythm of their days. He and Ezra rebuilt the fence along the north pasture, setting the posts deeper, running the wire tighter. He taught Hattie how to splint a broken bone. He sat with Clementine while she carved, offering quiet suggestions, never pushing. He let Sam follow him everywhere, answering every question with patience, even the ones that made no sense. On a cool morning in September, Josie woke to find Silas standing at the window, looking out at the valley. The sun was rising, golden and clean. She got up and stood beside him. He said, "I've been thinking," she said. "About what?" He said, "About what I want to do with the rest of my life." She waited. He said, "I want to stay here. I want to build something with you. I want to be a father to your children. I want to grow old on this land." He paused. He said, "I want to marry you." She looked at him. His gray eyes were steady, but there was vulnerability in them, the fear of a man who had been rejected so many times that he had stopped hoping. She said, "Yes." He blinked. He said, "Yes?" She said, "Yes, I'll marry you. I've been waiting for you to ask." The smile that spread across his face was something she had never seen before. It transformed him, smoothing the lines of worry and exhaustion, lighting his eyes. He laughed, a sound of pure joy. He pulled her into his arms and held her. She buried her face in his chest and felt his heart beating against her cheek. She said, "We should tell the children." He said, "They already know." She pulled back. She said, "What?" He said, "Clementine told me 2 weeks ago that she hoped I was going to ask you because she didn't want to have to find a new place to live." He paused. "Sam asked me if I was going to be his new papa. I told him I hoped so." She stared at him. She said, "They knew before I did?" He said, "Children see things." She laughed. She kissed him. It was the first time she had kissed him, and it felt like coming home. They were married on the first Saturday of October, in the yard between the house and the barn. The sky was clear, the air crisp. The cottonwoods had turned gold, and the leaves drifted down like coins. Martha Pendleton brought a cake. Deputy Carver came, wearing his good boots. Marcus Hull sent a letter, read aloud by Hattie, full of warmth and a few jokes that made Sam laugh, even though he did not understand them. Josie wore her best dress, the one she had worn to Thomas's funeral, repurposed and remade. Silas wore a new shirt that Hattie had sewn for him. The children stood in a row, clean and solemn for the first 10 minutes. And then Sam got bored and started chasing a grasshopper, and the solemnity dissolved. The justice of the peace from Miles City read the words. Josie listened to them, let them settle into her chest. For better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, till death do us part. She had said these words once before, to a man who had been taken from her too soon. She had thought she would never say them again. But here she was, standing in the golden light, holding the hand of a man who had come to her in a storm, wounded and running, and had stayed to build a life. She said, "I do." He said, "I do." And then it was done. The children cheered. Martha handed out cake. Ezra shook Silas's hand, a firm, adult grip that said more than any words could. Hattie hugged him. Bertie climbed into his lap and stayed there for an hour. Sam asked if he could call him Papa now. Silas looked at Josie. She nodded. He looked at Sam. He said, "I'd like that." Sam said, "Good." Then he ran off to chase another grasshopper. Clementine was the last. She walked up to Silas and held out her hand. In it was a carving, a small swallow in flight, wings spread, caught in the moment of taking off. She said, "For you." He took it. He looked at it for a long time. He said, "It's perfect." She said, "It's you." He knelt down and hugged her. She hugged him back, her arms tight around his neck. She said, "I'm glad you stayed." He said, "Me too." That night, after the last guest had gone and the children were asleep, Josie and Silas sat on the porch. The moon was full, silver and bright. The valley stretched out before them, quiet and dark and full of possibility. She said, "I never thought I would have this again." He said, "I never thought I would have it at all." She leaned against him. He wrapped his arm around her. They sat in the quiet, and it was enough. The years that followed were not easy. There were droughts and storms and hard winters. There were moments when the weight of the land pressed down so heavy that she wondered if they would make it through. But they did. They made it through because they did it together. The barn stood, patched and repaired, a testament to persistence. The cattle grew and multiplied. The children grew taller and stronger, each one finding their place in the world of the homestead. Ezra took over the farming, his hands as skilled as his father's had been. Hattie went to nursing school in Miles City and came back to work at the small clinic, delivering babies and setting bones. Sam never stopped talking, and he never stopped following Silas, learning everything he could about horses and the land. Bertie became a wild, fearless girl who rode better than anyone in the valley. And Clementine, the one who had been silent for so long, became a carver whose work was sought after across the territory. Her swallow, the one she had given Silas on his wedding day, sat on the mantel in the house, a reminder of the day she had found her voice. On a summer evening, years later, Josie sat on the porch with Silas. His hair had gone gray, and the lines on his face were deeper. But his eyes were the same, steady and warm. The children were scattered across the yard. Ezra's wife was there, holding a baby. Hattie was visiting with her husband. Sam was showing off a new horse. Bertie was chasing a flock of chickens. Clementine sat at the end of the porch, carving a piece of wood, her hair streaked with gray. Josie said, "Do you remember the night you fell off your horse?" He said, "I remember every detail. The rain, the mud, the way you looked at me like I was a problem you hadn't asked for." She laughed. She said, "You were a problem." He said, "I still am." She said, "You're my problem. I wouldn't have it any other way." He took her hand. They sat together, watching the sun go down over the valley they had built together. The light caught the cottonwoods, turning them gold. The creek ran clear and steady. The barn cast a long shadow across the yard. Josie leaned her head against his shoulder. He kissed her hair. She said, "We did it." He said, "We did." She said, "I love you." He said, "I love you too. Always have. Always will." The night came soft and warm. The stars came out. The children drifted inside one by one. The house filled with light and the sound of voices. Josie and Silas sat on the porch, alone, as the moon rose over the valley. She had no more words left to say. None were needed. She closed her eyes and listened to the sound of his breathing, and the creek, and the wind in the trees. And she thought about the long road that had brought her here, the losses and the gifts, the pain and the joy. She thought about the storm that had brought him, and the fire that had forged them, and the quiet, patient miracle of a life rebuilt from the ashes. She opened her eyes and looked at the man beside her. He was looking at the sky. His hand was warm in hers. She pressed it to her heart. And she whispered, into the darkness, a single word, not for him, not for anyone but herself. Home. This is Clint Dawson, and you've been listening to Frontier Heart Audio. Until next time, keep your heart open and your trails safe.